Chapter 329. South of Chongling, Divinity Bureau. This building that looked like an ordinary Taoist temple gave off a dark and cold presence. Other than a few important people deep in the imperial palace, all the nobility of the Qin dynasty were deeply wary and fearful of this place. But at this time, many people in this building had deep wariness and fear in their eyes. It was all for a woman in white. Yi Xiling walked off the carriage and walked alone along the gray stone path into the cold courtyard. Strands of sunlight fell from the mottled walls and sprinkled on her body. In the deepest part of the courtyard, a carriage was parked next to a dying tree. The carriage was a deep purple, the wood giving off a glossy light. There were patterns carved on it, and the carvings overlapped. It was also inlaid with gold and jade. It was extremely luxurious. Yi Xiling stopped and looked at this carriage. She laughed and said with slight disdain towards the study in the courtyard, "This should be Li Lingjuan's sandalwood carriage. I had not thought that you would take it. The bureau chief of the Divinity Bureau likes such vulgar things?" "I do not think about vulgar things. I just like the smell of the wood itself." A flat voice came through the unlatched door, sounding a little hollow. "You do not care about the appearance, but the smell. This wood is hard to come by, so it makes sense." Yi Xiling slowly turned around and did not move. She just looked inside through the half-closed door. Looking at the fine dust floating in the light, she said coldly, "Other people do not know your flying sword cultivation, but do you think I do not know? I have a reason for not wanting Bai Shanshui to die." "What is your reason?" The person behind the door was silent for a moment. "Do you really not know?" Yi Xiling said, "I really do not know." Putting away the bough after the birds are done. The person behind the door was silent for a moment. "But I am not doing this for myself. No matter who you are doing this for, I hope that you will not do this in the future." Yi Xiling looked up and said calmly and coldly, "I am me, you are you. You should know that I do not want to owe you anything." The person behind the door did not speak. Yi Xiling did not say anything else and turned to leave. However, the moment she took a step forward, the hollow voice behind the door sounded again. "There's something I didn't record in the report. Bai Shanshui's route is a bit strange. She seems to have gone to some alleys." Yi Xiling abruptly turned around. A yellow-robed cultivator walked out of the carriage and stepped onto the soft grass outside the gates of Min Mountain Sword Sect. The Min Mountain Sword trials had ended, but the cultivation teachers and court officials who had come to watch had not all left. Looking at the yellow robes of this cultivator and sensing his presence, they knew where this cultivator came from. All kinds of emotions appeared in their eyes. This yellow-robed cultivator was extremely respectful and low-key. He exchanged a few words with a blue-robed disciple of Min Mountain Sword Sect who was in charge of communication. Then he returned to the carriage and waited quietly. Thinking that the noble mistress of the palace was definitely not in a good mood, the teachers of the various cultivation places and the officials of the court did not dare to deliberately stay. Some of them who had originally planned to stay for a while left early. The surroundings of the forest quickly became increasingly quiet. The blue-robed cultivator of Min Mountain Sword Sect left and returned. Zhang Yi silently followed behind him, passing through the forest towards the yellow-robed cultivator's carriage. The yellow-robed cultivator had already reported his identity and intentions. However, Zhang Yi did not understand why someone of his status would cause that noble woman to make such arrangements. So the closer he got to the carriage, the more anxious he felt and the more uneasy he felt. When he saw Zhang Yi's figure, the yellow-robed cultivator walked out of the carriage. Then he bowed slightly to the Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator and Zhang Yi, who led the way from a distance. "Her Majesty told me to give this letter to you." Without any extra words, this yellow-robed cultivator said calmly as he looked at the Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator who had retreated to the side and Zhang Yi who had walked in front of him. Then he took out a letter from his sleeve and handed it to Zhang Yi. Zhang Yi's face instantly turned pale. Before he even touched the letter, his hands began to tremble. However, he didn't make any sound. He lowered his head slightly and opened the letter. Looking at the beautiful but powerful handwriting, his hands trembled even more. "I know." After reading it 3 times and confirming that he had not missed a word or comprehended the meaning of a word, he bowed slightly to the yellow-robed cultivator and said, I agree to this suggestion. The yellow-robed cultivator looked at Zhang Yi's pale but determined face and his trembling hands. He reached out as though he wanted to take back the letter. But the moment his fingers touched the letter was shattered by a gentle power, turning into fine dust that spread out in Zhang Yi's hand. This was a powerful cultivation state. But this yellow-robed cultivator, to the perfect woman in the imperial palace, was just an ordinary messenger. In Min Mountain Sword Sect, there were some courtyards at the foot of the mountain on the Green Jade Mountain path. Some new disciples, or those about to enter the sect like Zhang Yi, lived here temporarily. Zhang Yi returned to his temporary residence. Without greeting Dugu Bai and the others, he closed the door, entered his room, and spread out pen and paper. His face was still pale, but his hands had regained their stability. He quietly wrote a letter and left it on the table. Then he pushed open the door and left. A black cloud slowly flowed through the sky. A black eagle passed through the clouds and suddenly glided past a black mountain. The black mountain was not tall. There was no grass or tree growing on it, but there were countless gravestones of various sizes standing in a forest. There was an imperial entourage parked outside the mountain. There was a grave in a valley near the peak of the mountain. The gravestone in front of the grave was a small crown. The Qi Emperor stood in this valley with a sad expression. In the entire valley, on the entire mountain, only he was standing. When Zhang Yi left the letter and left, he was also looking at a secret letter that had just reached his hand. He was not so calm. After carefully reading the last word of the secret letter, he directly cried out loud. He cried very hard and very miserably. Teacher Ru, you left without any complaints, but after you left, I could not eat or sleep in peace. In my dreams, I often see the Qin army breaking into the city unstoppable. Teacher Ru, the Min Mountain Sword trials just ended. Do you know that Chongling has produced another genius youth like Jing Lioli and Enbausher? Teacher Ru, it is so bitter to think about it. When the Bazin Kendo ground was at its peak, the Qin had produced so many incomprehensible geniuses. Even now, there are still more. Is Yuan Wu really fated? Teacher Ru, Jing Lioli and Enbausher are already unmatched by the youths of the dynasties. In another decade, I fear that no one will be able to match them. But two such monsters are not enough. Now, another has appeared. We are fine. You managed to leave behind a disciple like this, but he buried himself with you. What does this mean? Every time I think of this, I want to go with you. Teacher Ru, if it weren't for the sake of the people of Qi Kingdom, I would have gone with you. The Emperor of Qi cried without the demeanor of a monarch. His tears flowed. The grave in front of him had been deathly silent and unchanged. Not even a blade of grass had grown. No cultivator could sense an unusual presence. But as his cries grew louder, the soil on the grave started to tremble slightly. It was just the black soil that was trembling, but it gave off a displeased presence that seemed to see through the Emperor of Qi. The Emperor of Qi widened his eyes. He stopped his sorrowful cries and occasionally sobbed. That aura of displeasure became even sharper, as if it didn't like being disturbed in peace. The soil on the top of the grave moved in the wind like burnt ashes. A dot of black light slowly came out. A black grass that gave off a dark and cold presence grew out. This black grass only had one leaf. When it grew out, it was facing the Emperor of Qi. But in a flash, the tip of the grass pointed in the direction of the Qin dynasty's Chongling. Emperor Qi's sobbing also stopped. After a moment of hesitation, he bowed towards the grave. The moment he turned around, his face was still filled with tears, but there was a layer of joy in the depths of his eyes. Chapter 330. This is simply nonsense. Do you think our Min Mountain Sword Sect is a city gate where you can enter as you please? You can leave as you please? You are also an idiot. Other people want to send in a letter. You let them send in a letter? Angry reprimands sounded in the mountain valley. Hearing the scolding of the middle-aged man, the young Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator in indigo robes felt extremely wronged. He thought, according to the rules, he should have brought in a letter from an outsider. Also, who was the person who delivered the letter? Could it be that he could refuse whenever he wanted to? Also, who would have thought that someone would choose to leave a letter after entering Min Mountain Sword Sect? Sect uncle who, what happened? A cold and authoritative voice sounded from the mountain path. Jing Liuli's figure appeared on the mountain path. Zhang Xiu had someone send a letter to Zhang Yi. Zhang Yi left the sect after leaving the letter. The middle-aged man was still angry. If this was a disciple who barely passed the trials in the past, then so be it. But this year's trials were much more intense than in the past. The people chosen in the end were all talents with potential. In his view, Zhang Yi's performance was outstanding. For all sects, people like Zhang Yi were more important than people who purely knew how to use the sword. He could become the unchanging foundation of the sect. Zhang Xiu had someone send a letter to Zhang Yi, and Zhang Yi left Min Mountain Sword Sect? Jing Liuli's eyes narrowed slightly. She glanced at the middle-aged cultivator and said, "What does the letter say?" The middle-aged cultivator of Min Mountain Sword Sect put away his anger and handed the thin letter to Jing Liuli. He said at the same time, "He only said that he was able to advance in the trials because of Xiao Wan. He feels guilty and asks us to replace him with Xiao Wan." Jing Liuli expressionlessly opened the letter and scanned it. She said coolly, "He is clearly a gentleman and needs to find excuses, but he mentioned Xiao Wan in passing. This seems hypocritical." While the middle-aged cultivator's seniority was much higher than hers, Jing Liuli had to make the decision on sect matters. So when he heard Jing Liuli say this, he immediately frowned and said, "Then what should we do? I don't know what Zhang Xiu forced him to make such a choice. For people like him and Ding Ning, you can't force them to do anything." Jing Liuli glanced at the middle-aged cultivator and said calmly, "Zhang Yi should care more about the big picture than Ding Ning. So this is at most a transaction. The only reason Zhang Yi would make such a sacrifice is because Zhang Xiu made a promise to Ding Ning and White Goat Cave's future." After a pause, she looked at the middle-aged cultivator waiting for her answer and said, "There is no difference between cultivating outside and inside the sect. He thinks that he is not a student of Min Mountain Sword Sect after leaving. That is just his own opinion. For me, this will allow Min Mountain Sword Sect to have another good student. You have seen Xiao Wan's performance. She is much better than the other so-called Chongling geniuses." The middle-aged cultivator was slightly startled. He looked at her slightly green face and couldn't help but feel great respect for her. A monster like Jing Liuli was much better than many people in Chongling. Many people will change, but people like Zhang Yi will not change. Jing Liuli glanced at the middle-aged cultivator and then turned to look outside the mountain. She said coolly, "Everything he does is for the big picture. He is sacrificing himself for his junior sect brothers to have a brighter future. So Master should be reassured to put a suitable sword manual in his hands." The middle-aged cultivator did not speak and nodded in agreement. The thin letter landed in Ding Ning's hands. Ding Ning seriously read every word on the letter. Then he slowly nodded at Gung Run and put away the letter. Seeing his true calm and not feigned emotions, Gung Run said softly, "It seems you really do not worry about your senior sect brother. People like my eldest sect brother, while sometimes wishy-washy, will always be more popular than people like me." Ding Ning looked at him and smiled slightly. "There will always be more people who like him than hate him. What do I have to worry about?" Gungren thought and said, "You do not care where Shui is buried?" Ding Ning said mockingly, "Since she can make my eldest sect brother leave Min Mountain Sword Sect, no matter where Shui is buried, it will be very grand." Gungren looked at him for a moment and shook his head. He sighed softly. "In reality, your greatest weakness is that you are too mature. Sometimes, it is better to be naive for your age to survive in Chongling." Ding Ning said, "Isn't it the same in the end?" Gungren did not discuss this with him. His gaze landed on the half-opened sword manual by Ding Ning's pillow. He said, "What do you think of it?" Ding Ning glanced at him. "If you are prepared for me to return to Chongling now, it should be ready when I arrive." Gung Run was stunned and said, "Comprehending is really not a problem for you." Ding Ning nodded and said, "This is not a problem. The problem is, you have helped me think, what kind of great service can allow me to quickly come into contact with the vital energy cultivation method you speak of?" Gungren looked at Ding Ning and said seriously, "As long as your body recovers quickly enough, there are ways." Ding Ning did not speak. Gungren continued, "There is a sect uncle who will accompany you back to Chongling." The moment he spoke, the half-closed door was pushed open. A man with a dark complexion walked in. This was clearly a quiet man with a lowered brow. But the moment Ding Ning saw this man, a black rock appeared in front of him. Then more black rocks appeared in front of him, blocking all the space and making it hard for him to breathe. This came from perception. Ding Ning had never seen this man with a dark complexion, but he knew this man's identity. At this time, other than Bailey Sushue, the last of the legendary people of Min Mountain Sword sect finally appeared in front of him. Like Gung Rian, Yintai Guanjian and the others, this was a person who could shake the decisions of the noblest and most powerful in Chongling. His surname was Xiao, and his name was Sharon. Xiao Sharon was his real name, and not a nickname or any other name. His adoptive father, Xiao Xian, had once been the most powerful barber on the Zhao border. The so-called barbers were killers who did not care about right or wrong. As long as they had enough money, they could even kill women and children. Xiao Xian had taken in a group of orphans and trained them to kill from childhood. Xiao Sharon was the strongest among them, because all the other orphans had died, and he was the only one left. Xiao Xian and some of his powerful subordinates had died at Xiao Sharon's hands. When he killed that group of people, Xiao Sharon was only 19 years old. Unlike the other legendary people of Min Mountain Sword Sect, Xiao Sharon was unknown. Even many old people of Chongling did not know that Min Mountain Sword Sect had such a person. Sect Uncle Xiao does not like to talk, but I think with your personality, you will get used to it and will not feel bored, Gungren said gently as he looked at Ding Ning's dazed state. Ding Ning laughed. He had a feeling that many people would be unlucky. Then can we depart? He picked up the open sword manual, patted the edge of the bed, and said to Gungren and Xiao Sharon. Gungren nodded. Xiao Sharon did not speak. He went forward to carry Ding Ning and then walked out of the room. A carriage was waiting for Xiao Sharon and Ding Ning at the end of Min Mountain Sword Sect's Green Jade Mountain path. Due to his misgivings about Ding Ning's wounds, Xiao Sharon walked very slowly. His back gave off a layer of gentle primal energies of the universe that wrapped around Ding Ning's body. But Ding Ning did not care about this. What he cared about was the flow of vital energy in Xiao Sharon's body. When Xiao Sharon put him into the carriage, closed the door, and rolled up the curtains slightly so that sunlight and air entered the carriage, and the carriage started to move, Ding Ning started to flip through the book. However, his thoughts were no longer on the 7 books of cultivation. The vigorous energies in his body started to flow on a completely new path. As the energies changed in his energy sea, Jade Palace, and Celestial Aperture, the vital energy started to flow in his body. Some of the dried-up meridians in his body started to become slightly moisturized like they were receiving a rain shower. As expected, the methods of Min Mountain Sword Sect were useful. Even the basic vital energy cultivation method of Min Mountain Sword Sect, the 7 books of cultivation, and the mysteries of Xiao Sharon's energy flow were enough to bring great benefits to his body. In the eyes of the Chongling nobility, he had successfully won the Min Mountain Sword trials. But only he and Zhangsun Qinxuan knew. The first thing he wanted to do in these years in Chongling was enter Min Mountain Sword Sect. Entering Min Mountain Sword Sect was the first step to his revenge. Chapter 331. In Falling Parasol, every morning when he held the bowl of noodles, Ding Ning thought about how to enter Min Mountain Sword Sect. He had entered White Goat Cave through Wang Taishu because after White Goat Cave merged into the Green Vine Sword Academy, the students of White Goat Cave qualified to attend the Min Mountain Sword Trials. But any careful plan would encounter unexpected changes. In White Goat Cave, he had encountered Li Daoji who had given him the last Flower Remnant Sword, a teacher like Shui Wangshu, a senior sect brother like Zhang Yi, and a junior sect brother like Shan Yi. There was also the information he had received from Lin Zhujiu before he killed Song Shanshu in Fish Market. Lin Zhujiu had been in the Great Floating Water Prison for so many years. For Lin Zhujiu, there was no hope. He was only living on a thread of obsession. Every time he heard the sound of water in Chongling, no matter if it was the raindrops falling from the sky or the sound of washing clothes in the streets, he could not be at ease. Therefore, he took this step a little too quickly. A little too quickly. Emotion was his greatest weakness. But after experiencing many things, he understood that emotion was more important than anything else in the world. This was the greatest difference between him, Yuanwu, and Zheng Xiu. Something could happen to him, but not to Zhangsun Qianxue. Even though he knew that Zhangsun Qianxue did not like to think about matters outside of cultivation, and that she was smarter than many people, if he took this first step, falling parasol, which no one paid attention to, would not be as calm as usual. She would fall into the eyes of more people. Sect Uncle Xiao, when we reach Chongling, help me find an old bookstore. Sensing the new changes that the vital energy cultivation method of Min Mountain Sword Sect had brought to his body, Ding Ning looked up slightly from the carriage and spoke softly to Xiao Sharon, who was driving the carriage. Xiao Sharon nodded slightly. He did not ask for the reason and said simply, "All right." Ding Ning immediately felt reassured. He put down the scroll in his hand and closed his eyes. According to the vital energy cultivation method of Min Mountain Sword Sect, the energies in his body started to flow smoothly again. The fourth realm had arrived. Realm 4 Energy Fusion, Realm 5 Spirit Thought. Based on his previous cultivation speed, he would need many years to reach Realm 5 from Realm 4. But now, he had the Emperor of Chu's Human Sovereign Jade Annulus, and the Three Corpses Non-Self-Consciousness Sutra that White Goat Cave had coincidentally obtained. Even if he could not obtain the heaven-replenishing divine art, his cultivation speed would multiply with the Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivation method he had obtained. Summer had just begun. By the time this year's winter solstice arrived, everything would go smoothly, and he would be able to step into the 5 realms. The sun was about to set. Ding Ning's carriage was heading towards Chongling. In the opposite direction, Zhang Yi followed some carriage wheel tracks and walked aimlessly. Looking at the wilderness on both sides of the road that was getting darker and darker under the setting sun, he felt lonely and sad. He did not notice a Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator dressed in green jade robes appear on a distant mountain ridge behind him. This Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator saw Zhang Yi's figure, and his eyes lit up. He was about to quicken his steps when he frowned and suddenly stopped. "What are you thinking about?" A cold voice reached Zhang Yi's ears. Zhang Yi, who had his head lowered, suddenly woke up. He looked in the direction of the voice and saw a man in a black robe standing by the side of the weeds. This black-robed man had a cold expression. There were no signs of age on his face, but he had a presence that the present nobility could not compare to. Zhang Yi did not recognize this black-robed man, but just from how the other seemed to appear out of thin air in front of him without him noticing, he knew that the other's cultivation far surpassed his. So he bowed with a shocked expression. "Elder, I know you are filled with many emotions." The black-robed man glanced at him, and then looked at the grass under the setting sun with his hands behind his back. He said self-deprecatingly, "Actually, even if it is not this scene of grass and sunset, even in the most prosperous place of Chongling, I will often feel such emotions. Chongling is so large, and there are more and more people. Why can't it hold even one of me?" Zhang Yi stilled. He did not understand the intentions of this black-robed man and instinctively called out, "Elder, Yi Zhangnan is one of my people." The black-clothed man waved his hand and said casually with a powerful aura, "I didn't want Zheng Xiu to have her way, so I made a bet with her. However, I didn't think that your junior brother would reject my good intentions. However, from the looks of it now, his choice was indeed correct. He does not need our help." Zhang Yi's breathing stopped, and he felt cold inside. Before and during the Min Mountain Sword trials, many people's performances and identities were secrets. But after the Min Mountain Sword trials ended, many people's identities naturally floated to the surface as the details of the trials spread. Some guesses could never be proven, but many smart people would point towards a certain answer. "We are the old nobility that many people in Chongling speak of." Looking at Zhang Yi's stilled breathing, the black-robed man's lips curled, and he directly revealed the answer. Zhang Yi naturally knew what the old nobility meant. He said with a stiff expression, "Why have you come to find me?" "You do not need to misunderstand." The black-robed man looked coldly at Zhang Yi with great confidence and said, "Where do you want to go now?" Zhang Yi hesitated and did not answer. The black-robed man said with slight disdain, "Accept Zheng Xiu's arrangements and go to a border place like Yinglei where there are not many families to teach people cultivation?" Zhang Yi was stunned. The black-robed man glanced at him and said, "You do not need to go before you arrived. That little cultivation place that did not even have a Realm 4 cultivator had disappeared. That place will be swept by bandits. Zhang Yi felt an endless chill in his heart, and his eyes were filled with disbelief. You find it hard to understand, and feel that I could not have seen the letter Zheng Xiu gave you? The man in black saw through his thoughts, but he still didn't give him a chance to speak. He said without hesitation, "There are many ways to achieve a goal. I can't see the letter Zheng Xiu gave you, but I can know what she wants you to do from some of the orders she gave to those border towns. Or rather, when some of her orders are being sent, my people will be among the officials carrying them out. Before you go, that cultivation place, and even that little city will disappear. You do not need to pay attention to her orders. In order to prevent you from worrying, I can create the illusion that you died on the way." Zhang Yi took a deep breath and suppressed his shock. He looked at the black-robed man who seemed to make the night come early and said in a trembling voice, "What do you want me to do?" "I said before, you do not need to misunderstand." The black-robed man smiled faintly. "But I am very satisfied with the performance of you and your junior sect brother Ding Ning. I just want Zheng Xiu to be unhappy, so I do not mind doing more. Since Chongling cannot tolerate you, there are places in the world that can tolerate people like you. I am just introducing a place to you." Zhang Yi said in puzzlement. "What place?" The black-robed man said, "Yin, Xanadu, Celestial Seal Sect." Zhang Yi's body shook and he instinctively exclaimed, "How is it possible?" The black-robed man frowned slightly and looked calmly at him. "What do you feel is impossible? Celestial Seal Sect is the top sect of the Yin dynasty. I am a Qin person. Even with your recommendation, how can Celestial Seal Sect accept me?" Zhang Yi looked at the black-robed man and said in shock, "Also, even if Celestial Seal Sect accepts me as a Qin person, how can I go to a Yin sect to cultivate? Why will they not accept you? Will Celestial Seal Sect not want a disciple that Min Mountain Sword Sect wants?" The black-robed man sneered. "Since I say so, I am certain that Celestial Seal Sect will accept you. The key is whether you go or not. As to you saying that as a Qin person, you will not go to an enemy sect to cultivate. So what if you do not go? Go to the borders of the Qin dynasty, and then find a small village. Live an ordinary and quiet life. Marry and have children, and live the rest of your life. When you are old, you will recall your life in Chongling. Or when you hear about the tragic encounters of your junior sect brothers in Chongling, you will be weak and powerless, unable to give any help." Zhang Yi's body uncontrollably trembled. His forehead and back started to sweat, but his hands and feet were extremely cold. The black-robed man did not look at him and turned to look at the setting sun. He said slowly, "Unlike Zheng Xiu, I will not ask you to do anything. Even after you go to Celestial Seal Sect to cultivate, you do not have to feel any connection to me. Also, there is not just one Min Mountain Sword Sect in the world. Celestial Seal Sect may not be inferior to Min Mountain Sword Sect. Zheng Xiu did not have you stay in Min Mountain Sword Sect, but I can give you an equal place to cultivate. As to the future, it is too far in the future. If you learn the methods of the enemy, you will become enemies of the Qin dynasty. That is a joke. Only true experts can decide where their path is." The black-robed man turned to look at Zhang Yi and then started to walk away on the grass. His voice reached Zhang Yi's ears clearly. "But first, you have to become a true expert." Chapter 332. Zhang Yi looked at the back of the black-robed man and could not calm his turbulent emotions. The old nobility of Chongling were a special group of people to the entire Qin dynasty. On one hand, they could not tolerate the present Chongling, but on the other hand, they had many industries and even trade with some enemy countries. The lifelines of some things were in their hands, and the mistress of Chongling could not easily cut them off from Chongling. This was a classic example of a difficult choice, but in the end, it was because they were strong enough. But now, how should he choose? As the sun set below the horizon, the air grew colder. Because his emotions were too turbulent, he did not even notice the wind created by the indigo-robed Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator behind him. This Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator was very displeased and frowned deeply. "Your performance right now is very different from during the trials. As a swordsman, you need to be vigilant at all times, especially outside Chongling. The people who want to kill you do not need to worry about not being able to leave Chongling. They have no misgivings. Hearing this voice, Zhang Yi was shocked and turned around. Looking at the other's special indigo robes and sensing the other's unique presence, he immediately understood the other's identity. But his mind was even more chaotic. He could not help but wonder what was going on today. The method of counting, 5 to 7. This Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator was used to seeing all kinds of top geniuses in Min Mountain Sword Sect. Seeing Zhang Yi's confusion, he was even more displeased. He said coldly, took out a cold metal box from his sleeve, and handed it to Zhang Yi. Zhang Yi instinctively took the seemingly ordinary metal box. His heart beat violently and he could not help but ask, "What is this? What is the method of counting, 5 to 7? Think about it yourself. If you cannot even think of this." The Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator raised an eyebrow. He originally wanted to say that if they could not even think of this, they did not deserve to be called students of Min Mountain Sword Sect. But at this point, he felt it was inappropriate. After a slight pause, he changed his words. "Just destroy the item in the box." Seeing the other's displeased expression, Zhang Yi thought of how Ding Ning usually called him wishy-washy. He woke up and looked away from this Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator to the metal box in his hand. Then, he directly opened the iron box. There was only a thin piece of parchment in the iron box. It was simply folded, so he could see many ink lines at a glance. It was just a few scattered demonic threads, but he could feel the endless and terrifying sword intent. His eyes instantly teared up from the stinging pain. In the next moment, these sword intents pressed down on his body, causing his vital energy and blood to be unable to circulate smoothly. It even made him feel like he was instantly injured and was about to vomit blood. Zhang Yi's body shook violently. Then, he raised his head in shock. He looked in shock at the indigo-robed cultivator in front of him. He thought of the presence of Jing Liuli and even Yintai Guanjian. He felt they could not have such sharpness. Then he immediately realized. This is Sect Master Bailey himself. This Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator felt there was no need to answer. He turned and started to leave. In your view, you are just an insignificant person in Chongling. Yet, the 3 top people of Chongling came to see you in person or wrote letters to you. Therefore, you can't be an insignificant person. The disciples of Min Mountain Sword Sect are the same as the disciples of the true people of the Bazin Kendo ground in the past. They cannot be insignificant people. Hearing the other's words in the wind before he disappeared, Zhang Yi's body started to tremble uncontrollably. Using the last ray of the sunset, he struggled to unfold the parchment in the iron box. His eyes stung even more, and tears fell. He only saw the first few sentences clearly, and his breathing sometimes stopped and sometimes became rapid. This was a sword manual. The method of counting, 5 to 7, was just a reading method. Only by looking at the words 5 to 7 times could one see the true words of this sword manual and comprehend the true meaning. There was usually only one possibility for Bailey Sushue to write in person and use this method to conceal the true meaning. This sword manual was very important to Min Mountain Sword Sect, and in Min Mountain Sword Sect, only Bailey Sushue knew of it. This meant that he was the true disciple of the sect master. Thinking of this, Zhang Yi finally understood the meaning of the last words of this Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator. How could the disciple of Bailey Sushue, the sect master of Min Mountain Sword Sect, be an insignificant person? The last light in the sky fell. The wilderness around him fell into darkness. If you are going to do it thoroughly. Ding Ning's voice sounded in his mind again. Thinking of many things in the past, thinking of Shui Wangshu's death, thinking of some scenes of the sword trials, thinking of the letter written by the mistress of the imperial palace after the trials, thinking of the glory he had obtained in exchange, he felt that Ding Ning's words were correct. He took the parchment out of the box, put it away, and then put away the box. Then he looked up at the brightest star in the sky in the direction of the Yin Kingdom and started to walk. The thunderous sound of horse hooves sounded on the river, startling countless returning birds. A row of torches illuminated the entire riverbank. A general in black armor jumped down from his galloping horse and landed on the ground as if he was weightless. But the moment he landed, he pulled the galloping horse behind him to stop. Right here, This black-armored general looked at the surrounding scenery and asked coldly to two children of 7 or 8 sitting in front of a soldier behind him. These two children were a boy and a girl. They seemed to be brother and sister. Judging from their clothing, they should be the children of the nearby fishermen. Hearing the questioning voice of this black-armored general, and then seeing the tiger and wolf inscriptions flickering under the light of the fire, the two children were terrified. They opened their mouths but didn't reply. Instead, they began to cry. The general in black armor took a deep breath, feeling even more irritated. However, when he squatted down and looked down, his expression changed drastically. Intense coldness and killing intent involuntarily flowed out from the depths of his eyes. On the intertwined roots of these willows, he saw 1 or 2 strands of white satin that had been soaked in water. Almost instinctively, he thought that this was where Bai Shanshui had been hiding. Countless ships and Qin dynasty cultivators were searching for Bai Shanshui around the Wei River. But who would have thought that Bai Shanshui had been like a floating corpse, floating between the roots of these old willows? This was a place that all passing ships could have seen, but in the end, only these two children had coincidentally seen it. Letting fate decide, was this the best way to escape? But the Holy One had flattened a mountain with a sword at the Deer Mountain Conference. If it was fate, it should belong to Chongling. How could this traitor escape again? This black-armored general thought of the Qin people who had died to Bai Shanshui in these years. His anger burned even hotter. But looking at the floating white threads, he knew he had missed the chance to capture Bai Shanshui. He did not know what price he would have to pay to deal with this great traitor. Because he was unable to vent his anger, his powerful aura constantly surged forward, causing the river water in front of him to churn violently. Ripples constantly spread out. In the deepest part of the great floating water prison, Lin Zhujiu, who was floating in the water, calmly sensed the ripples from the water prison beside him. This was meaningless to other people, but it was the only change in his boring and unchanging life of imprisonment. Young man, you are very amazing. Since this water prison was built, you are the second person that Shen Xian is helpless against. He lowered his head to look at the swaying ripples and sighed in admiration. His voice traveled along the water, clearly and far away. But there was no response. Lin Zhujiu looked at the rippling water surface and knew that the young man was not unconscious. So he said, I know you do not trust me, but I know you are different from those people who were sent in to try to gain my trust. Because I have experienced some of the things Shen Xian did to you, I know what kind of person can endure them. So you cannot trust me, but I can trust you. A long time later, a weak but clear voice came from the water prison. Who are you? Lin Zhujiu said. Bazin Kendo ground, Lin Zhujiu. The water prison was silent for a moment and said, Impossible. Lin Zhujiu laughed and said, Everyone thinks I am dead, but I am still alive. The water prison sank into silence again. Lin Zhujiu smiled and said, You should be wondering why even if I am Lin Zhujiu, I would speak so directly to a person I don't know. The other did not deny it. Yes, Lin Zhujiu said calmly, because no one feels that we can leave after coming here. For example, Shen Xian brought you here to let you know that even I can't get out for more than a decade. He wants you to despair. Despair is the best way for him to open the mouths of people like you and me. Lin Zhujiu looked up at the water prison and said coolly, But I think he will still fail. Also, I will give you hope. If you can hold on long enough, you have to believe that I can take you out. There was no new response from the water prison, only a faintly discernible muffled groan. The water surface started to ripple even more violently. Lin Zhujiu knew that a new round of torture had started. Many tortures that he felt were terrifying when he thought of them were falling on the young man. He gave the young man promise and hope, but was there really hope? Lin Zhujiu looked down at the rippling water surface and recovered his silence. Chapter 333. Since the start of the Min Mountain Sword Trials, Ding Ning of White Goat Cave winning first place, Liang Lian leading the army to capture Bai Shanshui, and Chongling shaking, many astounding events had happened in this period of time for the Qin dynasty. Yet this period of time was not long. Before the Min Mountain Sword Trial started, 2 cultivators dressed in ordinary Qin attire had set up 2 tents on a small hill and settled down. The two of them had clearly arrived together, but they didn't talk to each other normally. Even their tents were separated by a distance of several hundred feet. This small hill was in the middle of Min Mountain Sword Sect and Chongling. On this morning, these two cultivators who had come together but did not talk to each other saw a wisp of smoke in the distant mountains at the same time. Then the two started to prepare at the same time. Among them, the slightly skinny short-haired man carefully rolled up his sleeves and then began to regulate his breathing. Through continuous breathing, his face became more and more solemn and calm. His whole body gave people a feeling of exhaling the old and taking in the new. Gradually, a layer of jade-like fluorescence appeared. The other middle-aged cultivator used a wooden hoop to tie up his long hair. He wore plain robes and had a thin face. He looked like a teacher of an academy in Chongling. His preparation was not like that of a teacher. He only used a piece of white silk to continuously wipe a small golden sword. The short-haired man was the first to sense something. He raised his head and looked coldly towards a path in the direction of Min Mountain Sword Sect. Dozens of breaths after he looked up, the shadow of a carriage slowly appeared on that path at the end of his sight. As his gaze flashed, his sleeve fluttered slightly. Two weak silver lights flew out. They were not flying swords, but two strange silver insects the size of a person's index finger. These two flying insects stuck close to the ground, making their way through the underbrush and fallen leaves. The light on their bodies faded as they silently flew towards the path that the carriage was traveling on. The teacher-like, middle-aged cultivator looked calmly at the sky. His gaze was clear as he looked at the rising sun. He did not fear the blinding light at all. His eyes were bright, and the light that fell into his eyes seemed to be absorbed in the depths of his pupils. His pupils started to fill with golden lines. The patterns on the wings of the two strange silver insects looked like naturally formed runes. Inside the runes, there was a thin layer of pale yellow crystal, which was the condensation of the yuan qi of heaven and earth that the short-haired man had been constantly injecting into them during his daily cultivation. At this moment, under the guidance of his mind, the two long silver worms' wings folded together, and then they drilled into the soil under several fallen leaves, waiting for the arrival of the carriage. As the carriage got closer and closer, the two cultivators' brows unconsciously furrowed. The presence of the cultivator in the carriage was extremely weak to them and could be ignored. But the presence of the Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator dressed in indigo robes sitting at the front of the carriage was terrifying. Even from a great distance, their energy seas unconsciously trembled and became slightly numb. However, this was a situation of 2 against 1. In the few days they had spent here, even though they didn't talk much, these two cultivators had a clear understanding of the other's cultivation and some unique methods. So, these two cultivators still had great confidence. They were certain that this Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator was not Yintai Guanjian. As long as it was not Yintai Guanjian, in their view, even if Gung Ran and the others came, they still had a great chance of killing him. The carriage was still far from where the two silver bugs were hiding. However, without any warning, the expressions of these two cultivators changed greatly at the same time. They felt the coldest threat of death surround their bodies. The teacher-like middle-aged cultivator gave a shrill shout. The small golden sword in his hand immediately lit up with many golden lines of fire. At the same time, many golden lines of fire also lit up around his body. They were about to form a unique cage to cover himself and the cultivator next to him. But it was still too slow. When the golden lines of fire lit up, a gray sword light with terrifying murderousness had landed on the short-haired cultivator's neck. At this time, the short-haired cultivator had just shown his powerful cultivation. An ocean of primal energies of the universe came down from the sky and gathered into his body. At the same time, the astounding vital energy and primal energies of the universe accumulated in his meridians started to burst out. There was a soft sound. This short-haired cultivator, who had clearly reached mountain-moving realm long ago, didn't even have time to make any extra movements before his head was directly cut off by a sword. Under the powerful surge of energy, not only did his head fly high into the air, even all of the energy in his body immediately sprayed into the air, turning into countless specks of blood that scattered, dyeing the rain and mist above with a layer of red. There was no smell of blood in this hill. The headless corpse had lost all its blood and turned into a withered corpse. It fell forward like a piece of rotten wood. The scene was very horrifying and even disgusting. The golden lines of fire finally formed a cage, enveloping the middle-aged cultivator who looked like a teacher. But even under the illumination of the golden flames, the teacher's face was still extremely pale. "Cultivator of Nanua?" A demonic voice sounded from the forest on the side. Then a man dressed only in his undergarments appeared in his sight. "You are a cultivator of Yulong?" These two words of uncertainty struck this teacher-like middle-aged cultivator's heart like a hammer, making the golden threads of fire around his body even start to tremble slightly. From the corner of his eyes, he could see that the carriage was still moving forward. However, the terrifying aura at the front of the carriage had already disappeared. The green figure that had been sitting there had also disappeared. All that was left was an empty green jade-colored robe that was draped over the front seat. "Who are you?" The teacher-like, middle-aged cultivator struggled to speak. He understood how the other had silently approached him, but he still could not understand how Min Mountain Sword Sect could have such a terrifying cultivator other than Bailey Sushue and Tantai Guanjian. How could this person use just a ball of primal energies of the universe to support that robe and hide from the senses of him and the Grandmaster from Nanua? "Who sent you here?" Xiao Sharon looked at the middle-aged cultivator's pale face and did not answer his question. The middle-aged cultivator pressed his lips together and did not answer. Xiao Sharon's expression did not change. He was not skilled in interrogation to begin with and did not have much interest. He was only skilled in one thing in his life: killing. He attacked with his sword. It was a direct stab without any finesse. The tip of the light gray, crystal-like sword in his hand struck the golden curtain of fire at an unbelievable speed. The middle-aged cultivator screamed in shock. His vital energy gushed out of his body without reservation. The small golden sword was so bright it seemed to melt. The moment the gray sword pierced through the golden curtain of fire, it hit the gray longsword heavily. The golden flames swept up along the gray sword like liquid and was about to cover Xiao Sharon's fingers. Xiao Sharon frowned slightly. He did not change his stance as he spat. A small indigo sword as thin as a bamboo leaf came out of his mouth, piercing through the shattered golden lines of fire towards the middle-aged cultivator's forehead. The middle-aged cultivator was shocked. He flicked the 5 fingers of his left hand, and several substantial sword cheese struck the small green sword, sending it flying. Xiao Sharon's left hand shook slightly. A small transparent sword light shot out of his index finger. The middle-aged cultivator twisted his body, wanting to avoid this fine sword light. However, with a pu sound, his eyes widened to the extreme. He looked down in disbelief, only to see a blast of blood light already gushing out of his abdomen. Xiao Sharon calmly retreated. The golden flames burned a layer of his skin, but could not go any further. The middle-aged cultivator with his energy penetrated knelt on the ground in dismay. Looking at the tip of Xiao Sharon's foot, he realized that the blade had come from under Xiao Sharon's foot. This middle-aged cultivator was filled with disbelief and absurdity. How could such a powerful cultivator use so many little tricks? How could he have so many little tricks? Xiao Sharon had no interest in the middle-aged cultivator's thoughts. For him, for a very long time, killing people meant only survival. His left hand swung out without hesitation. A sharp presence flew out of his palm and cut through the middle-aged cultivator's neck. This middle-aged cultivator's head also fell from his neck, rolling down the sloping mountain slope. Xiao Sharon turned around without worry. The carriage had reached the bottom of the hill. Sensing this shocking but not soul-stirring battle, Ding Ning, in the carriage, had a hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth. No matter who set up these two assassins, he would be extremely vexed and heartbroken right now. Chapter 334. When 2 powerful cultivators from outside the Qin dynasty were killed by Xiao Sharon, the most skilled killer of Min Mountain Sword Sect, before they could even use their best moves, Palace Attendant Rong passed through the military camps and entered the main camp where Liang Lian was. She sat down across from Liang Lian. Liang Lian was drinking medicine. The medicine in the bowl was as thick as ink and looked extremely bitter. Ordinary people would want to drink it all, and then use a spoon of white sugar to seal their mouths. But he was expressionless and sipped slowly like he was drinking tea. Palace attendant Rong looked coolly at him and said, "Her Majesty is very disappointed in you. I am also very disappointed." Liang Lian stopped and looked at the medicine in the bowl. After a moment of silence, he said, "In the past, I thought that I was greedy and dissatisfied. I wanted to be made a marquis. Even if I could not gain a foothold in Chongling, I could at least find a fief. But yesterday, I thought clearly. These were all my wishful thinking. The Holy One and her wanted people to not remember the Bazin Kindo ground and those people. They wanted those people's names to disappear with the Holy One in the years before he ascended the throne. How could they let someone like me be made a marquis? My existence is to remind many people of the past." After a pause, Liang Lian smiled disdainfully. His smile was dark and cold, like the cold light of an arrow flying through the air on the battlefield. "This is just your personal thought." Palace attendant Rong looked at Liang Lian without changing her expression and said, "Her Majesty is very disappointed in you, but she still recognizes your abilities. If General Liang is loyal to his duty, in the future history books, General Liang's disgraceful deeds will be erased. Only your achievements will be remembered." The people of the Bazin Kindo ground disappeared because they saw too far and could not see what was in front of them. Who would look so far and not in front of them? Liang Lian looked coldly at Palace attendant Rong. "I just want to know what decree you brought from her." Palace attendant Rong looked at him and said calmly, "Her Majesty will have you lead an army to Nanyue. If possible, she hopes that you can be made a marquis in Nanyue like the other marquises." Liang Lian's eyes narrowed slightly. He picked up the bowl and drank. The medicine entered his throat like a knife. His voice was cold. "Marquis in Nanyue? Her Majesty really thinks highly of me. Nanyue's cultivators are all strange. They cannot adapt to the climate. The cold in winter, hot in summer, poisonous snakes and insects. Which one of these things do not kill people? Our army's cavalry, shooting, and seal chariots are almost useless. The Empress wants you to go, not because she wants to listen to your suggestions, but because she wants you to obey." Her Majesty is a marquis, Her Majesty. Palace attendant, Palace attendant. Palace attendant Rong's voice was calm, but she mercilessly interrupted Liang Lian. "As to her having you go to Nanyue, she has her own plans. When have you ever seen her send a talent of use to the Qin to their death?" After saying this, she stood up. Without looking at Liang Lian's expression, she bowed deeply to Liang Lian and then turned to leave. Liang Lian turned his head and looked out the window of the tent. He looked at some of the eaves of Chongling and was silent for a long time. For many years in the past, all he wanted to do was to climb up the social ladder. He did not want to be a dog that had a leash around its neck. However, after many years, when he thought about it now, he realized that when he followed those people, when his status was low, he did not seem like a dog. The carriage in the middle of summer was hot and stuffy. After the battles against the Han, Zhao, and Wei dynasties, and the bloody storms of the years before Yuan Wu's ascension, not just in Chongling and the Qin dynasty, but even in the world, there were very few Realm 7s who could fight against dozens of Realm 7s on the Bazin Kindo ground. There were not many powerful experts, and the one driving for him was an expert of this level. So Ding Ning lifted the curtains and allowed the wind to flow in through the two windows. The windows were open, and the air flowed. The people on the road could see the people sitting in the carriage. Just as they entered the streets of Chongling, a middle-aged man in silk robes came up to greet them. He bowed from a distance and said respectfully, "Mr. Taishu has asked me to deliver a message." The carriage paused slightly. Xiao Sharon did not sense any danger, so he did not show any murderous intent. "My people," Ding Ning said softly to his back. Xiao Sharon was silent. He nodded slightly and drove the carriage to the side of the middle-aged man who was delivering the message for Wang Taishu. The middle-aged man handed the letter in his hand through the window. Then he took 2 steps back and waited respectfully. Ding Ning opened the letter. When his gaze landed on the paper, his body suddenly froze. After a moment, he looked up and said to the middle-aged man outside the window, "I will go directly to Ink Garden and have Wang Taishu send my aunt to Ink Garden The middle-aged man bowed respectfully and then left. Looking at the middle-aged man's respectful attitude, and then thinking of what the gangster called Wang Taishu and Ding Ning had done in the past half-year, Xiao Sharon could not help but shake his head slightly. This youth from the wine shop was not an ordinary person, but his opponents in the trials thought of him as an ordinary person. Thinking so, he did not say anything. The carriage leisurely moved through the streets of Chongling towards Ink Garden. He had seen too many conflicts and killed too many people. Xiao Sharon was just following Bailey Sushue's orders to protect Ding Ning and kill all those who wanted to kill Ding Ning. He had no interest in participating in the schemes of any faction in Chongling. When the carriage stopped in front of Ink Garden, he said, "I will wait here. Do not mind me." These were the words Ding Ning liked to hear the most. He struggled out of the carriage and bowed in thanks to this cultivator who had killed his entire life and did not seem to know what to do other than kill. The high walls of Ink Garden had been opened long ago, and many shops had been built along the streets. Seeing Ding Ning walk out of the carriage, many of the neighbors who were busy with their work in the shops shouted excitedly and surrounded him. Ding Ning had won first place in the Min Mountain Sword Trials to fulfill his promise to Shui Wangshu and win glory for White Goat Cave. Yet the Qin dynasty was founded on martial arts and the sword. For these neighbors who had moved from Falling Parasol, this was naturally a great honor. Their way of expressing their love and respect for Ding Ning was simple and direct. The noodle shop owner who was most familiar with Ding Ning shouted the loudest, "Ding Ning, you old fogey. Next time you come to my shop to eat noodles, I will not charge you." Hearing these people's shouts, Ding Ning knew where these people's happiness came from. So he shouted back, "Of course, without the care of my neighbors, without that bowl of noodles every day, I would not have been first." These words were like a firecracker lighting up the festive scene. A wave of cheers and applause sounded. Ding Ning smiled and cupped his hands to express his thanks. He then patiently chatted with these neighbors for a while before entering the inner garden with the help of these neighbors. The numerous servant girls that Wang Taishu had arranged for were waiting inside. They sent Ding Ning to Forefather Zhou's small courtyard in Ink Garden. In the small courtyard, a middle-aged man who looked weak was waiting for his arrival. "In the past, you were weak. Now, it is my turn." When Ding Ning saw this person, he could not help but shake his head and sigh softly. This middle-aged man was naturally Wang Taishu. He looked at Ding Ning's pale face and smiled. "What should I do next?" Then he put away his smile and asked Ding Ning directly in a soft voice. He was now the most powerful person in Chongling, but this power came from Ding Ning's transactions and favors with the military nobility. Before Ding Ning won the Min Mountain Sword Trials, his relationship with the military nobility could continue. But now, everything could change. He did not worry about his own life, but the safety of the many people who lived with him in Chongling. "It will not be worse than before, only better." Ding Ning lay down on a bamboo chair in front of him. Then he looked at this worried Chongling hero and said seriously, "Zhang Xiu personally wrote a letter to my senior sect brother for him to leave my side. She is the person who knows how to weigh and trade, so she will throw out many conditions that are compensation to me. In the past, you and I were rootless duckweeds, but now it is different. Our backing is Min Mountain Sword Sect." Ding Ning paused and then looked at Wang Taishu. He said, "Since she cannot stop me from winning the Min Mountain Sword Sect, what she needs to do next is to bribe. Using a useful person is always more useful to her than destroying a person." Wang Taishu frowned slightly. He thought carefully about these words and said, "Then we only need to wait? Wait for her arrangements and Min Mountain Sword Sect's arrangements. Strictly speaking, you and I belong to Min Mountain Sword Sect," Ding Ning said calmly, "but you must first help me find where my senior sect brother went." Wang Taishu nodded. "Your letter says that while Bai Shanshui escaped, one of her companions may have entered the great floating water prison?" Ding Ning asked. Wang Taishu could not understand why Ding Ning would deliberately mention this matter, but he still nodded and said, "Yes. The people of the Astrology Bureau have occasionally gone to Falling Parasol these days." "Why?" Ding Ning asked. Wang Taishu did not answer. He could hear that Ding Ning was talking to himself. Also, this was not his problem, but Ding Ning's. Chapter 335. Wang Taishu left the courtyard. Ding Ning lay on the soft couch in the bedroom. The feeling of aging inside his body and the exhaustion from using energy to heal his wounds should have made him drowsy. But in this silent room, he did not feel sleepy at all and grew increasingly restless. This was his problem. He knew that this emotion came from the fact that his revenge had truly started, like an arrow that could not be retracted. This emotion also came from the fact that he was waiting for Zhangsun Qinxue. After cultivating quietly in the alleys of Chongling and waiting for his revenge for so many years, Zhangsun Qinxue was used to only cultivating, used to him thinking about other things. He was also used to Zhangsun Qinxue waiting for him in the wine shop and falling parasol. Her coldness seemed to be the source of his calmness and calmness in these years. With a habit, there would be a weakness. He was restless and could not remain calm. It was easier for him to think of more things. He thought of those people who had died a long time ago, and Xue Wangshu who had just died. In this cold room, Ding Ning felt more and more lonely. Yet the sorrow and anger in his chest burned like wildfire. The sound of cold and familiar footsteps rang out and entered his ears. Who was that person from Min Mountain Sword Sect outside? Seeing Zhangsun Qinxue push open the door and come in, Ding Ning's gaze stopped on her picturesque face and did not answer immediately. Zhangsun Qinxue was slightly displeased and frowned slightly. Ding Ning took a deep breath and said, "Xiao Sharon, I remember mentioning to you that he is a disciple the old sect master of Min Mountain Sword Sect picked up and brought back to the mountain. He is best at killing. If it was a true battle to the death, of all the people of Min Mountain Sword Sect, other than Bailey Sushue, I fear even Yintai Guanjin would die at his hands." Zhangsun Qinxue frowned and thought back for a moment. She said in a cold voice, "Why do I not remember you mentioning Xiao Sharon to me?" Ding Ning felt a chill run down his spine. He realized that there was indeed a big problem with his condition today. He had unintentionally said a very serious wrong thing. But today, Zhangsun Qinxue was slightly irritated. She did not think too much and did not dwell on this problem. Her expression grew colder, and she said, "Bai Shanshui came to Falling Parasol to find me that night." Ding Ning's body grew colder. He struggled to lift his head and looked at Zhangsun Qinxue. He said, "Wang Taishu told me that the people of the Astrology Bureau have frequently appeared around Falling Parasol these days. I did not understand the reason before, but now that I think about it, it must be because Bai Shanshui passed by Falling Parasol that night. Other than me, there does not seem to be anyone worthy of Bai Shanshui's attention, so the Astrology Bureau will investigate what connection Bai Shanshui has to us." Zhangsun Qinxue's face grew cold. Yi Xiling will definitely connect this to Fanjua's death. So, she will quickly discover my true identity? Ding Ning was silent for a moment. "You must leave Chongling," Zhangsun Qinxue said after a moment of silence. "I will not leave Chongling." Ding Ning's face immediately turned red. But because he was too agitated, he opened his mouth but could not speak. He coughed violently. "Leave Chongling and then continue to flee?" Zhangsun Qinxue's expression recovered. She said coldly, "I want to gamble." Ding Ning's breathing finally stabilized. He said angrily, "How will you gamble?" "Everyone wants to see Yi Xiling's true attitude." Zhangsun Qinxue said coldly, "Everyone wants to know if Yi Xiling is one of the Yuanwu Emperor's people or the one who taught her the sword. And then, if she is one of the Yuanwu Emperor's people, will you wait to be killed by the army like Bai Shanshui? Not everyone has the same luck as Bai Shanshui. Not everyone has such an expert swordsman to die for her." Ding Ning was so angry that he almost roared, "This is my matter. If you feel there is no hope, you can leave Chongling yourself." Zhangsun Qinxue looked coldly at Ding Ning and said with slight disdain, "Haven't you always wanted to know who Yi Xiling's heart belongs to?" Ding Ning could not speak. He knew she could not change what she decided. "This is yours." Zhangsun Qinxue took out a copper-green secret box from her sleeve and handed it to Ding Ning. Ding Ning looked silently at the box containing the human sovereign jade annulus. "You are in such a hurry to return to Chongling, but do not want to speak after seeing me?" Zhangsun Qinxue looked at Ding Ning, who was rarely so dispirited. She said coldly, "If you do not want to leave Chongling and want to stay and gamble with me, then at least tell me what to do next." Ding Ning took a deep breath and said slowly, since the Astrology Bureau has detected something. If you are not willing to leave Chongling, then you can only wait here for the result. Also, help me heal." Zhang Sun Qinshue glanced at Ding Ning and did not speak. She motioned for Ding Ning to move to the side. Then she closed the silk curtain and laid down next to Ding Ning. Like many cold female cultivators, she had a serious obsession with cleanliness. Today, Ding Ning's body was not clean. All kinds of ointment seeped through the gauze and stained the bed. But this time, she did not say anything. When she lay down, her tightly pressed lips trembled slightly. Just like usual, she lay on her side with her clothes on. Ding Ning could not see her face. At this time, he was only thinking about his own injuries and cultivation. He had Zhang Sun Qinshue wait, but he had to go out and make some preparations. Countless tiny noises resounded within his body. The withered yellow light spot in the pure white jade disc in his hand kept jumping. Waves of hot energy ran furiously through his meridians. The heat caused his meridians to feel as though they were about to burn. Yet each time his meridians felt as though they were about to burn, the cold presence coming out of Zhang Sun Qinshue's body would suppress them, and then the two would merge together perfectly. These energies flowed through his body according to the cultivation paths of Min Mountain Sword Sect. The damaged parts of his body were like dry land receiving rain, and were repaired at a speed ordinary cultivators could not imagine. The first step of his revenge had been from entering Min Mountain Sword Sect because the vital energy cultivation method of Min Mountain Sword Sect and the 9-death silkworm he cultivated complemented each other. Adding on the human sovereign jade annulus and Zhang Sun Qinshue's dual cultivation, his healing and cultivation speed reached an unprecedented and unimaginable speed. Even he did not know that under the influence of his presence, the last flower remnant soared by his side lit up as though it sensed an old friend. Small and beautiful white flowers bloomed on the blade. Thunder roared in the sky and fell with a muffled rumble. The clear summer sky was instantly driven away by thick rain clouds, and a rainstorm began to pour down before many people had time to prepare for it. Water fell like a curtain under the eaves. Yi Sealing sat barefooted on a low bamboo chair, hugging her knees like an innocent young girl. She looked at the dark sky, at the lightning and thunder inside, and in the direction of Ink Garden. Zhang Sun Qinshue's coldness only lingered a few feet around her. Even Xiao Sharon in a carriage outside the gates of Ink Garden could not sense it. Yet she seemed to sense the coldness coming from deep within Ink Garden. Her face was strangely flushed, but her body trembled like she was cold. No one knew what she was truly thinking. In these years, even Chief Inspector Chun, who was closest to her, and the old servant who always followed her, could not understand what she was truly thinking. She was living a glorious and difficult life in Chongling. During the torrential rain last year, she had been ordered to come back from overseas. The people of the Zhao Sword Furnace who had never entered Chongling had really entered Chongling. She felt that the unchanging Chongling with its white walls and black tiles had started to undergo an indescribable change. Now, it proved that her premonition was correct. The change had started in the torrential rain last year. What kind of change would occur in this year's torrential rain? The heavy gates of the courtyard in front of her were slowly pushed open from the outside. Yi Sealing suddenly looked up. A bright light appeared in the curtain of rain ahead. The falling raindrops suddenly paused, as though they were going to fly horizontally towards the person who had pushed open the door. Yet at this time, as she frowned, these raindrops seemed to break free of their restraints and fell back to the ground. Someone pushed open the door and entered, closing it behind them. This was a tall woman dressed in blue cloth robes. Her blue robes appeared overly large and stuck to her body wet. But what made her appear the most disheveled was her tangled hair. Her skin was white and glossy, but there was no color to be seen. She looked like an ordinary traveler who had been in the rain for a long time and did not have any powerful presence. Yet Yi Sealing knew who she was. He knew that the reason she had only attracted his attention when she pushed open the door was not just because he had been distracted, but because the other could merge into one with the rain. Yi Sealing stood up, his expression cold. He sneered. This rain suddenly came down and stopped just like that. By Shanxue, do you not want to live? Or do you have too much water in your head to come find me here? Chapter 336. The tall woman in the rain was naturally by Shanshui. Seeing the cold murderousness in Yi Seeling's eyes, she just passed through the courtyard and walked towards Yi Seeling under the eaves. She said, "What dare or not dare? I cannot even take one blow from you right now. What does it matter if the rain stops?" Yi Seeling looked expressionlessly at Bai Shanshui. Before he spoke, Bai Shanshui said tiredly, "Give me a bowl of noodles, and best if you give me some medicine to replenish energy." Yi Seeling frowned slightly and said, "You think I will help you?" Bai Shanshui had passed through the curtain of rain and walked in front of her. She did not stop and walked under the eaves next to her. She said quietly, "You will help me?" Yi Seeling sneered. "I, the bureau chief of the Qin dynasty, will help a great rebel like you?" Bai Shanshui's face was extremely pale, but when she heard her words, she laughed, and a faint blush appeared. "You are not just his disciple, but like Zhang Sun Qianxue, you are in love with him." Yi Seeling's eyes suddenly narrowed. He said coldly, "Bai Shanshui, you really think I will not kill you? If I wanted to kill you, I would have done so long ago." Bai Shanshui's unusual blush spread. She looked mockingly at Yi Seeling and said, "It seems that in your mind, he is more important than you." And Yi Seeling took a deep breath as though he was about to explode. Then he suddenly calmed down. After a moment of silence, he said coldly, "How can Yuanwu compare to him? How can he be more important than him? It seems that I guessed correctly, or rather, I won the bet." Bai Shanshui walked straight towards the room behind Yi Seeling. Her tired face once again flowed with pride and arrogance. Seeing Bai Shanshui walk into the room and start to undress and change into clean clothes, Yi Seeling did not speak and then walked to the kitchen to boil water. Yi Seeling's clothes were a bit tight for Bai Shanshui's figure. Bai Shanshui struggled a few times and found it very uncomfortable. She took off all her clothes and put on a black official robe of the astrology bureau. "Fortunately, I am a woman." Yi Seeling finished cooking the noodles and placed them on the table in the room. He looked at Bai Shanshui's long white legs as she walked and said coldly, "Pity that I did not think of myself as a woman before." Bai Shanshui smiled and started to eat the noodles. After just one bite, he praised sincerely, "Bureau Chief Yi is good at using the sword and cooking noodles." Yi Seeling glanced at her and did not speak. Bai Shanshui finished the noodles in a few mouthfuls without any ladle-like demeanor. She drank the soup and casually wiped the corners of her mouth with her sleeve. Looking at the torrential rain outside, she said emotionally, "I am probably the first person to eat the noodles that Bureau Chief Yi personally made." Yi Seeling sat down on the chair next to her. He also looked at the torrential rain outside and said, "The second." Bai Shanshui stilled slightly. She immediately understood who Yi Seeling was speaking of and fell into a daze. Where there is life, there is hope. Previously, you sang and fought in the streets of Chongling and appeared arrogant. But in all these years, you have only been arrogant once. Other people do not know, but I know you can endure it." Yi Seeling did not look at her and said slowly, "With your personality, since you escaped, even if you want to enter the city again, you will not gamble so viciously and put your life in my hands." "Why?" Before Bai Shanshui could answer, Yi Seeling slowly turned his head and looked at her. He said, "Because of the man in Shun Xian's hands?" Bai Shanshui nodded and did not deny it. She said, "Love is the hardest to name. At least, I owe him." Yi Seeling was silent for a moment and said, "Not from Cloudwater Palace?" Bai Shanshui shook her head. Yi Seeling nodded. "That is even rarer." Bai Shanshui smiled and looked at her. She said, "Tell me about you and him." Yi Seeling bowed her head slightly. After a moment of silence, she said, "When I first met him, I had not started to cultivate. I was just an ignorant child." "HM?" Bai Shanshui tidied her hair and started to listen to her story quietly. "The first time I met him, he was competing with Dongfang Su by the Wei River. With one blow, he defeated the most famous young swordsman of Chongling, Dongfang Su. I felt he was very impressive and dashing. I started to want to cultivate and get close to him. My father was an ordinary merchant, and my mother was a concubine. Hearing that I wanted to learn the sword, my father beat me half to death. So I left home and went directly to find him. I went to his camp. seeing me as thin as a stick. The soldiers guarding the camp all laughed at me. But when he saw me, he did not laugh at me and really taught me the sword. Listening to Yi Siling's quiet narration, Bai Shanshui started to think of many things in the past. She thought of that person's presence back then. She could not help but think that if she was in Chongling, she would also admire that person beyond redemption. But hearing this, Yi Siling had not been born for a long time. She could not help but take a sip of tea and ask, then? Then there was no then. Yi Siling glanced at her and said coolly, Yuan Wu and Zhang Xue worked together to start a mutiny in Chongling. Other than a few experts, all of the Bazin Kendo ground were trapped in Chongling. In the end, he died in Chongling. While he taught me the sword back then, I was only Realm 6. What was the use? Bai Shanshui thought of the bloody storm in Chongling that year, and the bloodbath in the next 3 years. She was silent for a long time and said, he trusted Yuan Wu and Zhang Xue too much. Yuan Wu could conquer the world, but not people's hearts. So how could he compare to him? As to what happened between him and me, it was so ordinary. There was no private relationship like you imagine. Back then, there were many women who admired him. He was so devoted. How could he fall in love with someone else? Yi Siling gathered his hair and looked at the distant black tiles. He said, you just misjudged the person. You cannot blame others. Bai Shanshui was silent for a long time and said, true stories are usually ordinary but cruel. Yi Siling turned to look at her and said, what do you want to do next? Bai Shanshui said, only your place will not be searched by the Astrology Bureau and Divinity Bureau. I want to stay here. I know you went a falling parasol that night, so you can be more honest. Yi Siling glanced at her with a calm expression, but the light in his eyes was unusually sharp. Bai Shanshui stilled and frowned. That is eldest Miss Gongsun. She took a deep breath, looked up at Yi Siling and said, the one with Ding Ning is not Zhangsun Qinxue, but the eldest miss of the Gongsun family. Yi Siling's body suddenly froze. The blood drained from his face, and his hands unconsciously trembled. You should not have done this. Consort Zhao said slowly, and with a hint of coldness. In front of her was Li Lingjun, whose face was unusually pale, and whose hands were trembling like Yi Siling's. She and Li Lingjun were standing in the grandest room of the Chu Palace. The ground around them was covered in the pieces of cultivator corpses, and the hanging curtains were covered in blood and flesh. Dozens of internal attendants were silently cleaning. She looked at the curved orange longsword stabbed into the ground next to Li Lingjun and said, I do not understand what grievances you have with that youth from the wine shop in Chongling. I only know that he is far from you. I only know that if you had not insisted on using so much power to assassinate him, these people would not have been so angry at you. Maybe this assassination would not have happened, and General Jean would not have died here. Li Lingjuan's lips trembled and slowly opened. Do not use the excuse of intuition and fate on me. This is only related to emotions and mood. Consort Zhao did not wait for him to speak and said, I only hope that you understand that there are many people who do not approve of you and me. The decision you make must be for the Chu, and not for your personal feelings. Otherwise, not just you, but even I may be killed. I know, Li Lingjun said after a moment of bowing his head. In reality, he could not understand why he had to kill Ding Ning. This was like an obsession that could not be explained by common sense. It was like a poisonous snake in his heart. While it was always in the corner, it always made him feel uneasy and inexplicably threatened. Consort Zhao did not say anything else. The bloody scene was quickly cleaned up, and it was as clean as before. Incense was burned, and even the smell quickly became incomparably fragrant. Consort Zhao walked towards Li Lingjun. Her clothing slowly slid down, revealing her perfect body. Her hand landed on Li Lingjuan's cold chest, and quickly caused his chest to burn. Her movements were seductive, but her eyes were clear. Both she and Li Lingjun did not have such desires physically, but this seemed to be a sacred ritual that could connect her and Li Lingjun together, and always be on the same side. Chapter 337. If I lose the bet, and Yi Siling is from Yuan Wu, can we escape Chongling like Bai Shanshui? No, because your true identity is known, and I won the Min Mountain Sword Trials, Zhang Xiu will make the connection. We added together are more important to her than the entire lonely mountain sword horde. You and Xiao Sharon encountered an assassination attempt by 2 Nanyue cultivators on your way here? Not 2 Nanyue cultivators, but 1 Nanyue cultivator and 1 Yulong cultivator. For Wang Taishu to find out about this, it can only mean that the officials who went to investigate were not discerning enough, Yi Futian said. It was Zhang Xiu? She would not be so lowly. She is just borrowing a sword to kill people. Borrowing a sword to kill people is what she is best at. But this time, she is not borrowing someone else's sword to kill me, but Min Mountain Sword Sect's sword to kill those 2 cultivators. Who wants to kill you? A grandmaster who can mobilize Nanyue and Yulong. Other than that Chu person who came to Falling Parasol, I fear there is no one else. Li Ling Jun? In Ink Garden, Ding Ning and Zhangsun Qianxue would have some conversations every day. Their conversations were the same as in Falling Parasol, usually short, but they were all matters of life and death. However, the 2 of them became calmer and calmer. After a storm, Chongling was unusually peaceful. The sky was clear, and coolness seeped into the rooms. It was a rare cool summer day. In the morning, Ding Ning ate pickled vegetables and intestines noodles. He took out a small copper shovel from the side room where the servants of Ink Garden had placed their miscellaneous items. He carried it into the garden and started to slowly turn the soil and move some of the flowers and plants. You know how to set up formations according to the situation? Zhangsun Qianxue hung several pieces of washed clothing on the line. When a beautiful woman like her did such an ordinary thing, it always gave people a strange feeling, as though such a scene should not happen. Ding Ning paused and looked at her. He said, cultivators are improving and changing. They cannot look down on other methods. I fear that it was not just the sword that killed him back then, but many other methods that he looked down on, Zhangsun Qianxue said coldly, looking down. Ding Ning was silent for a moment and nodded. No wonder he always dreamed of obtaining the cultivation method of Min Mountain Sword Sect. Other people may not be able to walk after 3 months of such injuries, but you recovered to such a degree in just a few days. Zhangsun Qianxue glanced at Ding Ning and said, looking at you, I know what the result would be when his cultivation method and Min Mountain Sword Sect's method met. If he had not been so proud back then and did not want to use petty methods to obtain the method, and Bailey Sushue was so petty that even Min Mountain Sword Sect did not open its gates to him. If he had obtained the method of Min Mountain Sword Sect back then, the result might have been different. Ding Ning looked down at the copper shovel in his hand and said, there are not so many ifs. Zhangsun Qianxue turned and walked towards the small courtyard they lived in. Did Bailey Sushue really not want to have any interaction with him back then because he was criticized by him and said that some sword moves were not good? Ding Ning paused and said, I do not know. Zhangsun Qianxue did not speak again. The conversation ended as they were used to. Ding Ning lowered his head and continued to dig. He made some trenches and moved some stones and wood. The countless little silkworms in his body spat out vital energy that formed a unique cycle. The energies in his body flowed according to the vital energy circulation method of Min Mountain Sword Sect. If any cultivator could sense the details in his body right now, even if they disregarded the 9-death silkworm method, they would be absolutely shocked, because this was 2 methods of cultivation at the same time. In just a few days, he had perfectly fused the 2 cultivation methods together, almost creating a new cultivation method. The strength of his vital energy was increasing at an incomprehensible rate to all cultivators. This was likely a cultivation speed that even the Yu Emperor had not reached back then. Ding Ning was certain that if he could continue to cultivate peacefully in Chongling, he would become the youngest Realm 7 cultivator in all of history. Yet as Zhangsun Qianxue entered Yi Xiling's sight, even the fastest cultivation speed could not compare to Yi Xiling's attitude. No army quickly appeared around Ink Garden, but this did not mean that her intentions were clear. Maybe it meant a larger and stronger net. The hot summer wind blew away the dampness and coolness in the alleys. As time passed, Chongling, after the Deer Mountain Conference and the Min Mountain Sword Trials, seemed to grow calmer. Many days after Ding Ning started to dig and move stones and wood in the courtyard, a carved carriage slowly drove to the front gates of Ink Garden. Behind this carriage was an ordinary carriage. An exquisite palace boot stepped out of the carriage ahead. Palace attendant Rong, with a calm expression, landed on the slightly hot stone ground in front of Ink Garden. Amidst the chirping of the cicadas, she slowly bowed to the Min Mountain Sword sect carriage that had stopped outside Ink Garden for a long time. She said, "I have come on orders to see Ding Ning." There was no movement from the carriage. But this palace attendant Rong knew this did not mean that the cultivator who was more skilled at killing than Yintai Guanjian was not there. It only meant that he had not refused. Palace attendant Rong bowed again without changing her expression and then started to enter the garden. Two attendants walked out of the carriage behind her, each holding multiple brocade boxes as they nervously followed. Wang Taishu had arranged for people to enter Ink Garden. Before palace attendant Rong truly entered the garden, Ding Ning, who had received a report from the gatekeeper, had washed his hands and was waiting for palace attendant Rong at the gates of the garden. Looking at palace attendant Rong, who was coming closer, Ding Ning's expression was calm, and he did not make a sound. Palace attendant Rong looked at Ding Ning, who was standing on the steps from afar. She walked close to him and then bowed. She said, "Her Majesty has sent down an imperial decree. Because the students of White Goat Cave have performed too well, the Green Vine Sword Academy will change its name to White Goat Cave. Your sect, Uncle Li Daoji, will be in charge of all matters. Shui has taught so many talents for the Qin dynasty. He will be buried in the tomb as a state scholar. Her Highness remembered your injuries and specially ordered me to send you some healing and nourishing items." Ding Ning looked at her and did not react. Seeing her not speak, he asked calmly, "Finished?" Palace attendant Rong frowned slightly and said with slight hesitation, "You are a smart person, so there is no need to say more." Ding Ning nodded. His gaze passed her and landed on the brocade boxes in the hands of the two attendants behind her. "Those are for me?" Palace attendant Rong looked at him and said, "Yes." Ding Ning did not even look at her. He walked past her and took the brocade boxes from the two attendants. Then he continued to walk towards the gates of Ink Garden. Palace attendant Rong frowned deeply. The two pretty attendants paled as they looked at Ding Ning. They did not know what Ding Ning wanted to do. Ding Ning calmly walked out of the gates of Ink Garden. Not far from the gates, there was a stream. It was very clear, but because many of the neighbors from Falling Parasol lived around Ink Garden, the water was slightly dirty. Looking at the dirty water with floating vegetable leaves and bubbles, Ding Ning opened all the brocade boxes. Without even looking at the contents, he flipped them over and poured everything into the dirty water. Two uncontrollable gasps sounded behind him. The two attendants paled. They had never thought that Ding Ning would do such a thing. Palace attendant Rong had followed Ding Ning out the door and was just a dozen feet away from Ding Ning. She frowned slightly and said in a cold voice, "This is equivalent to the taxes of a capital city for many years." Ding Ning calmly turned around and looked at her. He said, "So what?" Palace attendant Rong said slowly, "Even if it is compensation, do you feel it is not enough?" Ding Ning looked at her gentle face and apologetic gaze and smiled. "He's already dead. Can you still make it up to me?" If there is compensation, he did not look at palace attendant Rong and walked back to the gates of Ink Garden. "Unless you can have the old man come back to life and see me win. I did what I promised him, but he will not see it. What is the meaning in compensation? Sect Uncle Li Daoji will not return, even if he is in charge of the funeral. After he hears of what I have done today, he will respect my attitude." Ding Ning's footsteps stopped in front of the threshold. He turned slightly and looked at palace attendant Rong. He said seriously also, "You should remember what I said to you before Min Mountain Sword Sect." After saying this, Ding Ning passed through the gates and walked into the inner compound without looking at her again. Palace attendant Rong did not look back at Ding Ning. She was still not very angry and only felt that Ding Ning was very stupid. But she could not help but recall what Ding Ning had said to her before the Min Mountain Sword Trials. "After the Min Mountain Sword Trials, I will challenge you. I will kill you." She thought of Ding Ning's words, and then a coldness she had not felt for many years started to flow through her body. Chapter 338. Celestial Phenomenon Bodhi, Candle Dragon Pill, Fire Turtle Gallbladder. Even I have not smelled these things for many years. Do you not feel it is a waste to throw them all away? Seeing Ding Ning walk back into the garden and pick up the small copper shovel, Zhang Sun Qianxue sneered and said, "Those things can at least increase your cultivation greatly." Ding Ning glanced at her and said, "I do not lack that bit of time." Zhang Sun Qianxue was silent for a moment and said, "At least, she does not know our identities right now. Otherwise, she would not have sent people to deliver these things to you. You do not fear angering her by doing this?" Ding Ning said, "In reality, she does not like to obey." Zhang Sun Qianxue was inexplicably angry, her expression cold. "Is she a masochist?" Ding Ning wanted to answer her, but his gaze happened to land on a piece of soil that the copper shovel had just turned over. There were 2 bright red earthworms on the soil. He stilled and said, "I forgot something." Zhang Sun Qianxue frowned, but her attention was successfully attracted. "What is it?" Ding Ning put down the copper shovel and walked out. He said, "I forgot something was on the carriage." The carriage looked ordinary and had been parked outside Ink Garden for a long time. There was even a thin layer of dust on the carriage. Yet, other than the ordinary people in the streets who were isolated from the world of cultivators, many cultivators in Chongling knew that the carriage represented Min Mountain Sword Sect. "Your mind has been in chaos recently." When Ding Ning walked out of Ink Garden and approached the carriage, a voice reached his ears from the shade of a tree on the side of the carriage. "Sect Uncle Xiao." Ding Ning bowed to Xiao Sharon, who was not in the carriage, but sitting on a bamboo mat next to the tree. At the Min Mountain Sword Trials, almost all the cultivators of Min Mountain Sword Sect saw your performance. Xiao Sharon raised his head slightly to look at Ding Ning and said, "Your mind is meticulous and calm. Even we feel we are not as good as you. But you only remembered to come back to the carriage to get something now. You are very different." The first of the Min Mountain Sword Trials is just an empty name. If you are troubled by an empty name, then your name will become an empty name in the future. Xiao Sharon usually spoke very little, and people might even suspect that he was mute. Hearing his words, Ding Ning understood what he meant. But Ding Ning also knew that the matter that confused him was completely different from what Xiao Sharon thought. So he bowed deeply to Xiao Sharon again and said, "Thank you for your reminder, Martial Uncle Xiao." Then, he lifted the curtain of the carriage and walked in. In the corner of the carriage, there was a small open wooden box. The black iceworm that Qing Yaoyin had given him was curled up in the wooden box. This black iceworm had curled up into a ball out of extreme fear of Ding Ning's presence. Previously, it had felt a sense of security because Ding Ning was still in the carriage, and it had sensed a familiar presence. When Ding Ning left the carriage, he left it here and did not take it with him. It was terrified to the extreme. It had never encountered the hot presence of Chongling before. It wondered how there could be such a terrifying place in the world. At this moment, when Ding Ning lifted the curtain again and sensed Ding Ning's presence, the black iceworm's body suddenly stiffened. Its curled-up body that was as stiff as iron suddenly began to move. It began to tremble uncontrollably. If it had tear ducts, it would definitely be bawling loudly. Its tears would definitely fall like rain. Seeing the black ice worm tremble, Ding Ning felt slightly embarrassed. He picked up the wooden box and said sincerely, "Apologies." Hearing Ding Ning's voice, the black ice worm was even more excited and almost jumped into Ding Ning's arms. Zhang Sun Qianxue was still waiting for Ding Ning in the inner garden. Seeing Ding Ning walk in front of her, she looked at the ugly appearance of the black ice worm in the box and frowned deeply again. "What is this?" "Something that Qing Yaoyin raised. He gave it to me." Ding Ning looked up at Zhang Sun Qianxue and said this. The black ice worm in the wooden box stopped trembling. The air around it was still hot, but it could clearly sense the astounding presence of black ice inside Zhang Sun Qianxue's body. Just this feeling made it feel as though it had entered a world filled with black ice, and it felt comfortable. Ever since it had woken up from its daze and gained a thread of intelligence, it had sensed the presence of black ice in the world. When the first thread of primal energies of the universe had entered its body, a world filled with black ice appeared in its mind. It suddenly felt that this should be the world at the end of its cultivation. Yet, such a world appeared clearly in front of it. As it was shocked to the point of forgetting its terror, it could not help but think, was she one of them, their king? It naturally could not speak, but Zhang Sun Qianxue was not an ordinary cultivator. She could sense what it felt from some of the changes in its presence. Interesting. She looked at the ugly long worm that raised its head slightly, as if it was looking up at the legendary world. Her frown slowly loosened as she said this. Her personality had always been cold, and she was usually too lazy to interact with people. She rarely praised others. While she said it was interesting, it was a rare praise. As to beauty and ugliness, she did not have any concept. To her, some people were very beautiful, but they were very ugly. Some people were very ugly, but they were not ugly in her eyes. The black ice worm also keenly sensed her feelings. It was so excited that its body trembled again. Its slightly raised head lowered, expressing its respect and submission. Zhang Sun Qianxue looked at it and did not say anything. A thin thread of extremely condensed black ice energy came out of her fingertip and fell into the mouth of the black ice worm. The black ice worm devoutly and greedily opened its mouth and inhaled all of the black ice energy. It was like a calm pond had fallen into a waterfall larger than the pond. The entire pond started to boil. Its entire body began to tremble violently, and its crimson skin began to emit a cracking sound. His pores, which were usually invisible, opened up, but there was no airflow rushing out. A white frost spot instantly formed on its forehead, like a birthmark. Sensing the change in the black ice worm and the energy in its body merging and strengthening, Ding Ning looked emotionally at Zhang Sun Qianxue and said, "Just as I imagined, what will it become in the end?" Zhang Sun Qianxue looked at the deep red worm and asked. This was an incomprehensible cultivation process for her. Even her Realm 7 body could not completely withstand the energy of the sword in her body, but this long worm's body could perfectly absorb it. I do not know. Ding Ning shook his head and said, but I am certain it is much more powerful than the goo worms of the Nanyue cultivators. Zhang Sun Qianxue took the box containing the black ice worm from Ding Ning's hands and walked towards the deepest yard. She said without looking back, but that will also take time. Ding Ning did not say anything. He walked in front of the copper shovel stuck into the ground and continued to dig. His mind had calmed greatly. He knew Zhang Xiu better than anyone else. If Zhang Xiu started to suspect Zhang Sun Qianxue and his true identity, then Palace Attendant Rong would not have come with those precious rewards. Are you really not from Yuanwu? What happened to you that night? Why did you not appear? He bowed his head and thought of the female bureau chief who liked to wear white dresses and smiled in self-mockery. He and Zhang Sun Qianxue seemed to be waiting for judgment in Ink Garden, but in Chongling, who was not waiting for judgment. Not long after Palace Attendant Rong left, Ding Ning went out to the carriage and brought back the black ice worm he had forgotten for a long time. Not long after, Xiao Sharon, sitting on the mat under the tree, raised his head slightly. A youth appeared on the other side of the street. Xiao Sharon only glanced at the youth and then lowered his head again, ignoring him. The youth was dressed in black robes, his complexion and skin sallow. He looked like he had been seriously ill, but also like there was no illness that could cause a person's skin to be like this. He arrived at Ink Garden but did not enter. He started to silently do his work, sprinkling water and sweeping the ground to wash away some of the filth outside Ink Garden. Such puzzling actions quickly attracted the attention of the people inside and outside the garden. When this youth swept half of the street outside Ink Garden, Ding Ning passed through the noodle shop, came out of the door, and saw the youth. Yi Zhengnan? Ding Ning stilled. The black-robed youth put down the things in his hands and bowed seriously to him. Ding Ning returned the bow. He looked with a frown at this death warrior who had wanted to give him medicine at the Min Mountain Sword trials but had been refused. He said, "You are?" Yi Zhengnan looked at him and said, "I have paid back what I owe others. Now I owe you." Ding Ning shook his head. "You do not owe me." Yi Zhengnan said, "I owe you a life." Ding Ning looked helplessly at him and said, "I do not need you to pay it back." Yi Zhengnan did not say anything else and continued to sweep. Ding Ning grimaced. "I do not like to be too clean." Yi Zhengnan put down the things in his hands and then started to carry water for each shop on the street. "I have no place to eat. If you feel embarrassed, just treat me to 3 meals a day." Before Ding Ning could speak, he said respectfully and seriously to Ding Ning, Chapter 339. Ding Ning looked at this stubborn youth and thought of many old friends. He was silent for a moment and said, "People like you can eat anywhere. Why come to me? No one will refuse a death warrior as a retainer, but you keep on refusing." Yi Zhengnan looked down at the ground under Ding Ning's feet and said, "It was the same during the Min Mountain sword trials. You respected my life, so I respect your life. Anyone who wants to kill you will have to step over my dead body." Ding Ning opened his mouth, but before he could speak, Yi Zhengnan continued, "You do not have to refuse me. No matter how you refuse, I will not leave because this is my own choice. Also, I admire you." After a pause, Yi Zhengnan looked up at Ding Ning and said, "I admire you, Zhang Yi and the others. Compared to you, my life seems blank and meaningless. I want to become someone like you." Ding Ning shook his head and said, "Actually, there is no meaning," Yi Zhengnan said, "but at least I am happy." Ding Ning looked at his waxen face and eyes that were brighter than before. He could not say anything. He knew he could not change Yi Zhengnan's decision, just like he could not change the decision of the previous master of the last flower sword, because the rarest thing in life was happiness. Looking at the silent Ding Ning, Yi Zhengnan bowed slightly and picked up the broom to start sweeping again. "Actually, I envy you." In Yi Xiling's courtyard, Yi Xiling looked at the medicine jar in front of him and said coolly, "At least you are happy in your actions." Sitting on a soft couch not far from her, Bai Shanshui smiled slightly and also looked at the warm medicine jar. She did not immediately respond and said, "I had not expected Bureau Chief Yi to be a pharmacist." Yi Xiling said in a self-deprecating manner, "A prolonged illness becomes a doctor." Bai Shanshui glanced at her with complicated emotions. "Actually, I should envy you. The cultivators in the world only see great rebels like me, laughing in the mountains and forests, taking revenge as they please. But they do not think that you just have many things to worry about, so you cannot be like me. I have just cultivated my sword and have nothing to worry about. The mountains and rivers were destroyed, and the sects were annihilated. Not to mention those close friends and family, even those old friends who had some interactions and could be considered to be congenial had all been wiped out. Every time the sun sets, it is really like the shadow of a shadow hanging by a thread. It is inevitable that the state of mind is desolate." The medicinal soup was already slightly boiling, but it would still take a lot of time for several bowls of water to boil into a single bowl. Yi Xiling listened to Bai Shanshui's words and thought back to the events of the past decade or so. He suddenly felt like he had been dreaming. It was as if those people dressed in fine clothes and riding horses, holding swords and laughing arrogantly were still in front of him. Why had so many things happened? Why had it been so long? Bai Shanshui originally did not want to speak, but at this time, she suddenly sensed something. She frowned slightly and said, "Strange." With a light breeze, she stood up from the couch and walked towards the door. Yi Xiling glanced at the medicine pot and then followed her. He said gravely, "What?" Bai Shanshui did not immediately answer him. Her gaze landed on the side of the wall. There was an open ditch on the side of the wall. The rainwater falling from the eaves would gather in this ditch. Then this ditch would pass through the wall and gather in the larger ditches on the two sides of the streets of Chongling. Washing rice, washing clothes, washing carriages, and drinking horses all used the water in these ditches. Because of the heavy rain a few days ago, the water in these ditches was very full, almost level with the ground and the roads, and appeared filthier than usual. "There is medicinal energy." Bai Shanshui said these three words. Yi Xiling did not misunderstand. When Bai Shanshui spoke, a gentle presence came out of Bai Shanshui's body. Faint mist started to rise from the ditch flowing through Yi Xiling's courtyard. The mist was like a scarf made from the softest threads that slowly floated in front of Bai Shanshui. Tiny droplets of water kept falling down and landing on Bai Shanshui's palm. They swirled around like dew on a blade of grass and then disappeared without a trace. Yi Xiling started to smell the medicinal energy in the glowing water droplets. Her brow furrowed deeply. The smell of the medicinal energy was very chaotic. It gathered many spirit medicines that even she could not obtain. These medicines can only come from the palace. She turned her head and said to Bai Shanshui. Bai Shanshui nodded. Many spirit medicines that were precious to the cultivators of the world had fallen into the dirty water of Chongling streets. Such a thing was hard to understand, and likely could only occur in Chongling. But just like how Chongling had a woman like Yi Siling, these spirit medicines that had inexplicably melted in the dirty water were a heaven-sent opportunity for her. The mist floated lightly and became transparent under the sunlight. The glowing water droplets continued to appear in by Shanshui's palm. Yi Siling looked at this scene and said, "Cloud Water Palace's water manipulation is the best in the world." By Shanshui's face shone with a strange light. She turned to look at Yi Siling and said, "Cloud Water Palace's water manipulation is the best in the world, but its killing intent is not as good as Bureau Chief Ye's One Sky Water." Yi Siling looked into her eyes and said, "Maybe we can learn from each other?" Bai Shanshui laughed. "This originally existed in my imagination, but I always felt it was impossible." In the next breath, Bai Shanshui's smile faded. She nodded seriously and said, "I wish for it. Maybe we can comprehend some other things together, like the lonely mountain sword horde." After Yi Zhangnan finished sweeping the streets around Ink Garden, he helped the neighbors with chores, repairing houses, carrying water, and chopping wood. The people of Falling Parasol were simple to begin with. Seeing Yi Zhangnan so capable, and hearing that Yi Zhangnan had no home to return to, without Ding Ning's arrangements, the neighbors arranged a room for Yi Zhangnan, and he had no worries about his meals. When he picked up the crude bowl the neighbors were most used to using in Falling Parasol and started to eat dinner, he saw a figure that looked lonely, not proud, but wild and hard to tame walk towards him. He put down the bowl and looked at the figure that came closer. He looked at the other's clearly thick clothing on a summer day. He looked up slightly and said softly, "I know you. You are Li Shixing." The youth who slowly walked in front of him under the setting sun was Li Shixing. "I am Li Shixing." He walked to Yi Zhangnan's side and sat down on the steps next to Yi Zhangnan. Not good at conversing with people, he sank into silence. Yi Zhangnan looked curiously at him. "You came to find Ding Ning?" "I originally wanted to tell him I am leaving." Li Shixing glanced at the depths of Ink Garden and said, "You came to bid farewell?" Yi Zhangnan was shocked. "You are in the top 10 of the Min Mountain Sword Trials, and have entered Min Mountain Sword Sect to cultivate. Why are you leaving?" Li Shixing did not immediately respond. Yi Zhangnan reacted but still said in puzzlement, "You are now a disciple of Min Mountain Sword Sect. Even if the family is dissatisfied with what you did in the Min Mountain Sword Trials, they should not take their anger out on you. With Min Mountain Sword Sect's way of doing things, they will definitely protect you." "Of course I am not afraid." Li Shixing shook his head and said, "But no matter how I disobey my father's orders, my father is still my father. I do not fear what others do to me, but I must consider what others do to my father." Yi Zhangnan was stunned. He started to understand Li Shixing's meaning. "You want to take responsibility for this? Then where are you going?" He could not help but ask Li Shixing after a moment of shock. "I will return to outside the pass. Since they do not like me staying in Chongling and want to exile me outside the pass, then I will return." Li Shixing stood up and said to Yi Zhangnan, "I originally wanted to bid farewell to him in person, but now that I am here, I think there is no meaning. You can tell him when the time comes." "Wait." Looking at Li Shixing's back as he walked back the way he came, Yi Zhangnan took a deep breath and said, "You think of him as a friend. He naturally thinks of you as a friend." Li Shixing nodded and did not say anything else. His figure lengthened under the setting sun and disappeared from Yi Zhangnan's sight. A middle-aged man with an ordinary appearance and attire watched Li Shixing leave from the gates of Ink Garden. Even Yi Zhangnan had not noticed when he had arrived, and had not even noticed his existence up until now. This middle-aged man who looked so ordinary that people would forget him nodded in greeting to Xiao Sharon, who was still sitting on the mat under the tree. Then he passed through the gates and walked towards the inner courtyard of Ink Garden. Ding Ning walked out of the innermost courtyard and bowed to this seemingly ordinary man. Sect Uncle Gung ran. Chapter 340. Gung Ren returned the greeting and then looked at Ding Ning. He said, "Li Shixing just came. He originally wanted to bid farewell to you, but he has left." Ding Ning was silent for a moment and said, "He is a friend worth treasuring." After a pause, he asked, "Where did he go?" Gungren said simply, "Outside the pass." "All right." Ding Ning thought for a moment and then looked up at Gungren. He said, "Sect Uncle Gungren, have you thought of a way for me to help Min Mountain Sword Sect?" Gungren looked at Ding Ning and did not immediately answer. He said, "Your eldest sect brother Zhang Yi is heading to the Yin dynasty." Ding Ning frowned. This does not seem to be her arrangement. Gungren nodded and said, "Yi Xiao met with Zhang Yi after he left Min Mountain Sword Sect. Yi Xiao is one of the leaders of Chongling's old nobility, so this should be their arrangement." Ding Ning thought for a moment and then asked, "So what Min Mountain Sword Sect wants me to do is related to the Yin?" Gungren looked at him and did not answer directly. He said, "You and Wang Taishu have an extraordinary relationship. We want to borrow Wang Taishu's power." Ding Ning looked at Gungren and said seriously, "What do you want Wang Taishu to do?" Gungren said, "We want him to go to the Yin, so that he will no longer be a gangster in Chongling, but the leader of the Yin capital." After saying this, he felt that Ding Ning would be shocked. It was very unlikely for a gangster who had established himself in Chongling to cross mountains and rivers to rule in an unfamiliar capital, much less the capital of an enemy dynasty. But to his surprise, Ding Ning's expression was calm from beginning to end. "Why do we need to do this?" Ding Ning asked calmly. "Why does Min Mountain Sword Sect have such an idea?" Gungren slowly said, "The Yuanwu Emperor flattened the Deer Mountain Conference with one blow and suppressed the three dynasties. But looking at the overall situation of the Deer Mountain Conference, we still have many doubts. Chu and Qi had done their best, but Yan's Celestial Seal Sect was not limited to this. Ordinary cultivators may think that Celestial Seal Sect is slightly weaker than Min Mountain Sword Sect and Lingshu Swordgate, but we know this is not the case." Ding Ning listened attentively and unconsciously frowned. "So you think that Zheng Xiu might have other arrangements in Yin?" Gungren nodded and said in a calm tone, "In the Qin dynasty, there is no power that can stop Min Mountain Sword Sect from gaining a foothold. But if the Empress has a powerful hidden pawn, the result will be different." "I will persuade Wang Taishu to go to the Yan Xanadu," Ding Ning said. "He will listen to my suggestion." Hearing Ding Ning's direct and certain answer, Gungren was not used to it and stilled slightly. Ding Ning continued, "In the conflict with that general last year, most of his brothers died. While he reached his present position because Shui showed Realm 7, Chongling's waters are too clear and not suitable for people like them to survive. I also heard that the Yan Xanadu is more chaotic than the Chu. The more chaotic, the easier it is to gain a foothold." Gungren nodded and said, "The Yin Emperor saw the strong foundation of the Qin dynasty and wanted to learn from the Qin reform. But he did not have the people of the Qin dynasty who could suppress a group of serpents. So the present Xanadu is more chaotic than Chongling during the reform." After a pause, he looked at Ding Ning and said, "We are not skilled in the ways and rules of the marketplace. You have a close friend like Wang Taishu, and it is suitable for you to go to Xanadu. Min Mountain Sword Sect cannot interfere in a matter like this on the surface. So all the Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivators in Zhengxiu's site will not go to the Yin. But this does not mean that Min Mountain Sword Sect does not have swords to go to the Yin." "I understand this." Ding Ning glanced at him and said, "Everyone will have a few swords hidden." Gungren's eyes flashed with a rare light. This was true fondness and praise for Ding Ning, and joy that the matter could be completed. "If Wang Taishu leaves for the Yin, you can enter the Sword Tower to study the heaven-replenishing divine art. Other people are leaving their homes, but you are learning the supreme method of Min Mountain Sword Sect. Your business is really good." When Gungren left, Zhangsun Qinshua's cool voice sounded behind Ding Ning. "While the Yin and Chongling are far, if Shangxiu's hand has reached here, it will not be so simple. Do not say you do not know the danger. While it is dangerous for our situation, this is his best path of retreat." Ding Ning turned to look at her exquisite face and said, "You should understand this. Some things, once the first step is started, cannot be stopped." Looking at Zhangsun Qinshui, who was silent, Ding Ning said, "Theoretically, if you win the bet, and Yi Sealing guesses who you are, she will quickly come to see you. The more she does not appear, the more unusual and dangerous it is. Those who can leave without being caught up in this should leave." Zhangsun Qinshui looked at him, and a scornful smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. She wanted to mock him coldly, but for some reason, she did not want to say anything today. She turned around and took a deep breath. Her gaze landed on a corner of the wall. There was a bunch of dark-colored flowers with an ordinary yellow butterfly resting on top of it. The yellow butterfly gently flapped its wings. There was no sound of wind, but in her mind, a great storm formed. The medicine was poured into the ditch by Ding Ning, that wine shop youth who won the Min Mountain Sword Trials. Zhang Xiao sent palace attendant Rong to see him. He poured all the spirit medicines she brought into the ditch in front of Ink Garden. Yi Xiling held a small scroll between his fingers and described the contents to Bai Shanshui. Then a strange expression appeared on his face. During the storm last year, I came back to see the seventh disciple of the Zhao Sword Furnace, Zhao Zhan. Starting from then, Chongling, which had been peaceful for a long time, seemed to be in constant turmoil. I remember that I saw this wine shop youth once that day. The paper scroll became inexplicably moist in her hand, and then it slowly became soft as if it had been soaked in water for a long time. In the end, it turned into pulp and dripped down between her fingers. She looked at Bai Shanshui with a strange expression and smiled inexplicably. Now that I think about it, the origin of all of this commotion seems to have come from the day I saw this wine shop youth. Bai Shanshui did not speak. Looking at her strange smile, she knew she did not need to explain. She was close to the truth. Because of that person, her country was destroyed and her family was lost. Because of that person's disciple, Zhang Sun Qianxue, caused her senior sect brother, Fanjua, to die. Because of that person's disciple, she met Li Yunrui. Even though she was seriously injured, because that person's disciple poured many spirit medicines into the ditch, and she and Yi Xiling studied each other's techniques, she gained many benefits. Even the hidden injuries that had not healed for a long time could be healed, and her cultivation could advance greatly. In this life, she seemed to have fallen into this fate. Your Chongling's buildings and roads are so square. Are your Qin tombs also square? Bai Shanshui smiled inexplicably and asked Yi Xiling. Yi Xiling looked at her smile, and then at the distant eaves of Chongling. She laughed again. You mean that all of Chongling is like a tomb? Such a large tomb. I do not know how many heroes were buried here. Those people who were invincible for a time turned to withered earth in the end. Bai Shanshui laughed without any ladle-like demeanor. She created something out of nothing in front of her, and once again created many glowing water droplets. But this time, the water droplets flashed with countless sword lights, as though they were hiding even smaller transparent swords. A light flashed through Yi Xiling's eyes. She said sincerely, Bai Shanshui, your sword cultivation is very strong. Bai Shanshui glanced at her and said sincerely, my strongest skill is still luck. Yi Xiling looked down at her hands. Originally, she could not have been slower than Bai Shanshui in comprehending sword moves and cultivation methods. She had become a cultivator later than many people in Chongling, but she had reached Realm 7 faster than most people. But ever since Bai Shanshui came, and guessed that the woman in the wine shop who was so beautiful that even Li Lingjun was moved was Zhang Sun Qianxue who had a great relationship with that person, she was not as calm as she appeared. Especially when she was certain that person's heir might appear. Her emotions fluctuated even more. At this time, her hands were no longer trembling, but the energy around her palms rippled like water. She had thought that she had experienced countless storms, and could even endure the bloody storms of the years before Yuanwu's ascension without batting an eyelid. But when the result came after many years of waiting, she found that she could not calm down. She was very urgent. How long will it take for you to recover? She asked Bai Shanshui when she looked up again. Be patient. Bai Shanshui looked at her and said, just a few more days, and I can kill Xinxian. Chapter 341. To be able to win and to be able to kill were two completely different concepts in the world of cultivators. Ever since the battle on the Wei River last year, Bai Shanshui had suffered repeated defeats as though Chongling was a city of misfortune to her. But today, her misfortune had turned to joy, and her cultivation level had risen. Congratulations! Yi Sealing softly congratulated, and then shook his head. He said, "The great floating water prison is not as simple as you imagine. It is not enough to just kill Shen Xian. I cannot act." After a pause, Yi Sealing looked at Bai Shanshui and said, "I am not like you. I must ensure that I can stay in Chongling." "I understand." Bai Shanshui smiled slightly and said, "If I act, no one will even detect your one sky water. I know that I alone am not enough, so I will find the eldest miss of the Gongsun family. For now, I will call her Zhangsun Qianxue. She owes me a life, my senior sect brother's life." Bai Shanshui took a breath and said, "She cannot refuse me." Yi Sealing calmly turned his head and said, "I hope you can succeed. How many people are left who can stand against Yuanwu and Zheng Xiu?" Bai Shanshui smiled self-deprecatingly and said, "If I cannot succeed even like this, then I can only treat Chongling as a grave and bury myself here." The hot summer had arrived, and only the morning was slightly cool. Because of the presence of Min Mountain Sword Sect's carriage outside Ink Garden, few cultivators passed by. Only the part of the courtyard where the residents of Falling Parasol lived grew more lively and slowly turned into a market. Wang Taishu came down from the carriage and looked at the bustling market. He could not help but shake his head. Only the youth in the garden would be able to make such a cold and aloof place like Ink Garden so approachable. He had entered Ink Garden many times. Many of the people in charge of daily life were his trusted subordinates. But this time, Wang Taishu's expression was especially grave. He quickly passed through the courtyard where he could see everything and walked into the deepest part of Ink Garden where Ding Ning and Zhangsun Qianxue lived. When he saw Ding Ning waiting for him, he frowned and said, "Even the letter is not safe. What is it?" Another day has passed. Ding Ning looked at Wang Taishu's slightly white hair, then raised his head slightly and looked at the rising sun with emotion. Then he said slowly, "I want you to go to the capital of the Yan dynasty." Wang Taishu raised his eyebrows slightly and didn't say anything. He just looked at Ding Ning. Ding Ning slowly recounted the contents of his conversation with Gung Ran, including the fact that he didn't ask for Wang Taishu's permission before making the decision for Wang Taishu. After Ding Ning finished speaking, he looked at Wang Taishu and said, "This sounds like a transaction. I am using you to exchange for my benefits, but you know this is not the case." "I will prepare." Wang Taishu's expression was unreadable. He looked calmly at Ding Ning and said, "Since the letter is not safe, I will try to leave someone in Chongling. While it will take months to travel to and from the yin, it may be useful." Ding Ning looked calmly at him and said, "After this farewell, I do not know what will happen in the future." On the distant streets of Chongling, a procession was leaving Chongling. There were many carriages and horses. Along the way, many people were sending them off. All kinds of pastries and fresh fruits were shoved onto the chariots as though they were free. Drums and horns sounded, accompanied by faint cheers that passed into Ink Garden and into the ears of Wang Taishu and Ding Ning. Ding Ning frowned slightly and said, "What is this sound?" Wang Taishu carefully identified the direction and said, "It is Song Run, the general of the Tiger and Wolf Army. He has received a reward and is to lead the army to guard the pass. He was previously famed for his bravery and is skilled in night attacks. People call him General Night Flying Leopard. Now, he should be officially leaving the city, and the entire city is sending him off." Ding Ning thought for a moment. "He is Liang Lian's confidant?" Wang Taishu nodded. "It appears that she is completely disappointed in him." Ding Ning smiled faintly. "He should be leaving Chongling soon." Wang Taishu's eyes flashed with a cold flame he did not usually see. He said, "He should have been seriously wounded in the battle against Bai Shanshui. Do not think about taking care of this matter before leaving Chongling. Since Zheng Xiu does not want him to die and only wants to send him elsewhere, even if he is seriously wounded, it will not be easier to kill him than at other times." Ding Ning saw his meaning and shook his head. He said, "Also, your thoughts are his thoughts. He will also want to take care of some things that displease him before leaving Chongling. You and I are not the same. I am a direct disciple that Min Mountain Sword Sect has sent people to protect. You are just a gangster. Killing you will not make Zheng Xiu more disappointed in him, and will not change the fact that he is leaving Chongling. So you must leave early. If you leave now, people will feel that you are avoiding a disaster, and will not think that you are going to the Yin capital. You have never missed what you said before, so I will leave quickly. The person I left behind is called by Nanshi. His shoes are different from others. Other people cannot see it, but I believe you can. After speaking to Ding Ning, Wang Taishu did not linger and quickly left. A person like him also needed a lot of time to leave Chongling. Liang Lian is the person you spoke of who betrayed Li Guanlan back then? Zhang Sun Qianxue was like Ding Ning's shadow. But when Wang Taishu's figure disappeared from Ding Ning's sight, she appeared behind Ding Ning. Ding Ning was used to this. He did not turn to look at Zhang Sun Qianxue and just nodded. Zhang Sun Qianxue looked at his back and seemed to see through his body. She said coldly, "You want to kill him before he leaves Chongling?" Ding Ning did not deny it and said, "If he goes to a remote place, I do not know how long it will take to kill him." Zhang Sun Qianxue heard his slightly bleak voice and said, "But you just said that he is harder to kill than usual." Ding Ning sighed softly and said, "So we can only wait. If a chance appears." He turned around and looked at Zhang Sun Qianxue, who did not want to speak. He said seriously, "I will first kill that palace attendant surnamed Rong because she is easier to kill." Zhang Sun Qianxue was too familiar with Ding Ning. She saw some flashing light in his eyes and knew that some plans were brewing in his mind. Then continue to wait. Wait to be killed or kill. In any case, I do not want to wait for long. She said 3 sentences in a completely different manner than usual. Then she pressed her lips together and turned to walk back to her bedroom. Who wants to wait for long? Ding Ning sat down on the steps and looked silently in the direction of the voice. He said to himself, "Speaking of waiting, no one will wait as long as me and will not have such a painful wait." He could not understand why Yi Siling still had not appeared in front of him. While he was waiting in Chongling, Zhang Yi was hurrying along the Qinchu border. For some reason, that old nobleman who liked to wear black robes promised Celestial Seal sect would take him as a disciple, but did not make arrangements for his journey. Without official documents, cultivators of the Qin dynasty like him could not pass through the many capitals of the Chu dynasty and then travel to the Yin dynasty's heartland bordering the Chu dynasty. When he took a detour around the Qinchu border and slept for several days, he finally encountered a caravan. Strictly speaking, this caravan was doing legitimate business, but it was not a large business. So it could not compete with the other businesses in the Chu and could not make a living. They could only use manpower and time to exchange for some meager profits. Through the Qinchu border, they transported some tea leaves and satin produced by the Qin to the Yin dynasty. At the same time, they took some rewards and brought back some Yin people who wanted to return to the Yin dynasty from the Qin. Because this caravan was too small, the Yin people they brought back along the way were not likely to be escaped criminals or other important people. They were usually old soldiers, workers, and craftsmen who had been stranded in the Qin during the past battles. There were no powerful people in this caravan, only some martial artists skilled in using blades and arrows. So when they discovered Zhang Yi's identity as a cultivator, even though they did not know what kind of cultivator Zhang Yi was, this caravan easily accepted Zhang Yi. When traveling along the desolate border, the possibility of encountering bandits was small, but they might encounter bandits pretending to be bandits, and even some legendary beasts. Traveling in the scorching heat was a very uncomfortable thing, especially for some of the old people who were already very weak. So on this morning, an old man who had paid some rewards for the caravan to bring him back to the Yin border started to vomit. While the leader of this caravan had arranged for him to ride on the most docile horse, this old man still vomited. In the summer, the foul-smelling vomit covered the old man's clothes and dirted the saddle of the horse under him. Seeing this scene, other than the leader who frowned and threw him a wet cloth, the people around the old man could not help but cover their noses and mouths and tried to stay away. But Zhang Yi walked over and comforted the old man's back. He started to wipe the old man and feed him warm water. Chapter 342. Sympathy and pity were emotions that normal people would have. However, the long journey was full of danger. Even some cultivators would often pay attention to their own stamina and mental state. No one wanted to create side issues and add more burdens to themselves. Seeing Zhang Yi walk up to take care of the old man, most people in the caravan did not feel admiration or shame. Instead, they had disapproving or disdainful expressions. They could all see that this old man was not vomiting because of heat stroke or eating dirty food, but because the old man's body was too weak to begin with. If the body was too weak, this would happen again and again in the long journey. He might even die along the way. If he started to take care of the old man now, he would not leave him alone in the future. Taking care of this old man would become his own matter. Even more importantly, this old man had a strange temper. He was likely a soldier of the Yin dynasty who had been captured in the war against the Qin dynasty and forced to do hard labor for many years. He was extremely disrespectful to the caravan members in his words, and often took advantage of his seniority. He was very dislikable. Zhang Yi, on the other hand, did not have any superfluous thoughts. If there was an old person who was unwell and needed to be taken care of, he would naturally extend his hand to help if he could. To him, this was as simple as eating when he was hungry or drinking when he was thirsty. He didn't show any displeasure because of the unpleasant smell and very carefully wiped away the vomit on the old man's chest. After drinking several mouthfuls of warm water, this old man dressed in gray robes, with a withered face and hair so dry it looked like dry grass would grow on his head at any time, could finally breathe normally. But as the water churned in his stomach, he felt stifled in his chest. He did not care that Zhang Yi was wiping him away and started to vomit again. With Zhang Yi's present cultivation, even if the old man was a cultivator of the same level as him, if he stabbed at this time, even if the two were so close, he would be able to react in time. However, his hand was supporting the old man's back. Because he feared that his movements would cause the old man to fall from the horse, he only pulled back his hand and turned his body slightly. As a result, his sleeves and the robes on the side of his body were splashed with the old man's vomit. Even so, Zhang Yi did not feel any disgust in his heart. However, what he did not expect was that the old man became angry. Looking at the water bag in his hand, he angrily said with an obvious Yin accent, "My stomach is so uncomfortable, and you still feed me water. Do you think I haven't vomited enough?" Hearing the old man's angry voice, the caravan members who had been unable to avoid him frowned. They thought this old man was completely ignorant. Zhang Yi was also startled, but he wasn't angry at all. Instead, he bowed slightly and apologized, explaining softly, "If you vomit too much, it's easy to lose water. In this kind of stuffy summer heat, it's even easier for your body to not be able to bear it." The old man retched a few more times, and the sounds coming from his stomach and throat made the people around him, who were walking silently with their heads down, feel a little uncomfortable. But the old man sneered and said in unclear words, "Since this is the case, you should find me herbal water or light salt water, not this kind of water that is neither hot nor cold." The old man's tone caused many people in the surroundings to become angry, but Zhang Yi was not angry. He stilled and said, "Sir is right. I will first clean you up, and then I will help you flush the salt water," he said apologetically, and then helped the old man wipe his robes and saddle. Seeing Zhang Yi's respectful attitude, the old man's expression froze slightly. But the discomfort of his body did not put him in a good mood. He made an indescribable sound from his throat and turned his head away, not looking at Zhang Yi. The Qin, especially the Qin in Guangzhong and Chongling, were amenable to persuasion but not coercion. They did not have much tolerance for people they did not like. Seeing the old man's reaction, the caravan leader, Luo Zhongjing, a man in his 40s, with short hair and a clear scar on his left cheek, narrowed his eyes and sneered. He said, "You can't tell good from bad. Why care about him? Have the Qin not killed enough Yin people in these decades?" Hearing this, the old man, whose eyelids were heavy due to his weakness, was furious again. He said shrilly, "You took my money. Are all Qin people untrustworthy?" Luo Zhongjing looked directly at the old man and said disdainfully, "Do you need me to return the money to you and leave you here?" The old man's face paled, and he was momentarily speechless. Zhang Yi grimaced at Luo Zhongjing and said softly, "The old are respected." Luo Zhongjing sneered, "I think the old are disrespectful." Zhang Yi opened his mouth and wanted to say something. The caravan leader turned his head and said in a cold voice, "We have only met by chance. Mr. is not an ordinary person. We naturally respect and want to rely on Mr.'s power. But this person has insulted the Qin dynasty. Now, he cannot tell good from bad. We cannot work with him. If Mr. wants to take care of him because he is old, then his matters will have nothing to do with us." Zhang Yi felt slightly bitter inside. Looking at the old man's ashen face, he could not bear it. He hesitated and then nodded. Luo Zhongjing's expression did not change. But intentionally or otherwise, the distance between him and the other members of the caravan and this old man grew. Seeing the other members of the caravan cut him off, the old man from Yan's anger lessened greatly and he appeared even more dispirited. But as his gaze moved, he looked at Zhang Yi, who had been following him from beginning to end. His eyes were still cold and displeased. The dusk grew and vision was blocked. Under the leadership of the experienced caravan leader, the caravan set up camp on a slope to rest and cook. Knowing that the caravan members greatly disliked this old man, Zhang Yi set up a tent dozens of feet away from the outermost tent of the caravan. He took some herbs that repelled mosquitoes and scattered them outside the tent. Seeing Zhang Yi take care of this old man from Yin so carefully, most of the caravan members could not understand. But out of respect for a cultivator, after the food was cooked, someone still brought 2 portions to Zhang Yi's tent. The caravan's food along the way was very simple. The staple was boiled dried sweet potatoes, and the pickles were minced meat soup made from dried meat and wild vegetables. "I want to drink minced meat soup, not potato soup." Looking at the food delivered to him, the old man from Yin, who had rested for a long time, showed his domineering and unreasonable side. He pulled over a food box filled with minced meat soup, and then poured the other bowl of minced meat soup into the food box in his hand. Then he started to drink. For the first time, Zhang Yi frowned slightly. He was not angry and said worriedly, "Your stomach is very weak. You can only eat less to nourish your body. Eating meat like this is not good." This old Yin man did not seem to hear Zhang Yi's words. After drinking all the minced meat soup in the food box, he turned around and said coldly, "You are Qin. I am Yin. Why are you helping me like this? Who knows what you are thinking, but no matter what you are thinking, I advise you to rest. I don't even have extra money on me. I just want to die in my homeland. That is why I am suffering with your Qin caravan." "Sir, you may have misunderstood." Zhang Yi looked at the old man with cold eyes and said sincerely, "Respecting the elderly is your duty. There is no free meal in the world." The old man sneered and said, "Since you say respecting the elderly is your duty, then my body is very uncomfortable right now. I want hot water to bathe. I see that they are slightly afraid of you. You must be a rare cultivator. It is not impossible for you to get some hot water for me to bathe. You should know that with my body's condition, if I do not have hot water to bathe, I fear that I will get poisonous sores and die along the way." Zhang Yi glanced at the old man. He was not angry but felt that the old man was speaking the truth. He looked around and nodded. "If so, please wait for a moment, mister. What is he going to do?" The caravan members looked in puzzlement at Zhang Yi, who was starting to get busy. They saw Zhang Yi borrow the iron pot from the caravan to boil water. Then he walked to a hard rock on the slope and started to move his sword. As the sword flashed, large pieces of stone flew up. After the water in the iron pot boiled, Zhang Yi first poured filtered cold water into the hole he had dug, and then hot water. After testing that the water temperature was just right, he walked towards the old man. At this time, all the caravan members finally reacted. They had spent so much effort, and even used vital energy that was precious to cultivators, just to serve this old man in his bath. Is there something wrong with his head? The caravan leader Luo Zhongjing could not help but curse. Chapter 343. Even powerful cultivators could quickly enter a meditative state to cultivate, but the process of the 5 energies and primal energies of the universe turning into vital energy would take a lot of time. Especially in a place like this where they could be attacked by bandits, or beasts at any time. Ordinary cultivators would not waste vital energy and would maintain their vital energy at an abundant state. The caravan leader, Luo Zhongjing, was not a cultivator, but he had seen many cultivators fight. So based on the scene of Zhang Yi using his sword to take the stone, he was certain that Zhang Yi was not someone strong enough to wantonly waste vital energy. So Zhang Yi's actions were very stupid in his view. But for Zhang Yi, it was different. Just like in the Min Mountain sword trials, what many people thought was meaningless was more important than Zhang Yi's life. Because of this, he was himself and Zhang Yi. Before the old man took off his clothes and bathed, he carefully tested the temperature of the water. He even picked some medicinal herbs that had some effect on rheumatism, skin rashes, and sores, and put them in the water. He even started to wash the old man's clothes. After washing them, he used precious vital energy to shake off all the moisture in the clothes so that the old man's gray robes were as clean as new. Looking at his proper and gentle posture, the old man's clean robes, and the unpleasant smell no longer entering their noses, for some reason, even Luo Zhongjing, who had cursed Zhang Yi angrily before, fell silent and felt a different emotion. After soaking for a long time like bathing in a hot spring, the old man, who had changed into clean clothes, gave a satisfied groan. But he still did not thank Zhang Yi, burrowed into the tent, and quickly fell asleep. Zhang Yi inspected the tent and confirmed that the cool mountain wind was not blowing directly at the old man's face. Then he started a fire next to the stone pit where the old man had bathed. When the wood turned to red charcoal, and there was no longer the pungent smell of smoke, Zhang Yi solemnly and carefully took out the sword manual that Bailey Sushue had personally written from his chest and started to study it seriously. The sword intent in this sword manual was extremely aloof, like the icicles in the wind at the highest peak of Min Mountain. He could not help but feel a stinging pain in his eyes when he looked at it, and a chill like ice needles piercing through his skin. This kind of sword essence did not match his gentle and scholarly personality. But for him, this sword manual represented Min Mountain sword sect's recognition and praise of him. This was a great honor and also a great weight. So he would do his best to learn this sword manual. With true respect and gratefulness, and not fighting against this sword essence, he assimilated even faster. Like he was following in Bailey Sushue's footsteps, his mind immersed in each sharp stroke. If the Min Mountain sword sect cultivator who had been ordered to pass him the sword manual could clearly know his cultivation state, he would be deeply shocked by his cultivation progress. Zhang Yi's mind wandered along with the strokes on the sword manual. Unknowingly, he forgot the passage of time, even the environment he was in, and the original meaning of the words on the sword manual. His mind was empty as the tip of the brush flew quickly, like the mountain wind shuttling between valleys, like a meteor streaking across the sky, like a fish suddenly jumping out of the water, splashing up waves and then disappearing. The tips of these brushes were like swords that jumped up and down, turning into countless mysterious traces in his perception. Everything flowed so smoothly as though it was natural. In reality, the sword essence that this sword manual gave off was as proud as the icicles in the wind at the peak of Min Mountain. It only represented Bailey Sushue's personal state and personality, just the appearance of this sword manual, and not the true meaning of this sword manual. The true meaning of this sword manual was that the sword heart was brightly lit. This was natural. The truths that many people told you were not true truths. Only the truths you took for granted after hearing them were your true truths. A true gentleman would not be affected by external things, and would not go against their own path. When he did things and used the sword, he would understand the truths of this sword manual, and use the sword essence that was natural. If Zhang Yi was just like some hypocritical gentleman in Chongling, and did things differently from what they thought, then even if he had a sword manual like this, he could not comprehend the true meaning within. So Bailey Sushue chose the correct sword manual, and the correct person. When his consciousness followed the flowing strokes until the last stroke soared into the sky, Zhang Yi felt his body become lighter. It was as if his soul had leaped out of his head and rushed into the sky to look down at his body. This feeling was wondrous and novel, but also terrifying. Zhang Yi woke up with a start. He found that his clothes were soaked in dew, and the distant sky was bright. A night had passed silently. All of those sharp brush strokes disappeared from his consciousness like a tide, but when he retreated towards one place, they seemed to leave a mark on the beach. A clear sword path appeared in his mind. He comprehended one sword. He started to comprehend the first sword of this sword manual. He woke up with a hiss. There seemed to be a passageway in the depths of his heart. Yet, what caused him to widen his eyes in confusion was that he clearly felt some quick energy vibrations in front of him, but he did not feel any energy coming out of his body. His vital energy did not even consume a bit of his body's vital energy. An extremely smooth and comfortable feeling immediately spread throughout his body. At this time, the yin old man in the tent turned over and woke up. His turbid eyes immediately became crystal clear. Just now, all the energy vibrating in front of Zhang Yi had gathered in his eyes. But in the next moment, his eyes became turbid again. "I want to drink water." Then he shouted at Zhang Yi in an unfriendly tone. Hearing the old man shout, Zhang Yi did not think much. He put away the small sheepskin scroll and came to the old man's tent. "I want to drink hot water, not warm water." The old man seemed to think he had not come fast enough and said angrily, "All right." Zhang Yi did not say anything. He turned and walked faster towards the caravan camp. When Yi Zhengnan woke up and walked out of his little room, he found a handsome man with sharp brows standing next to the Min Mountain Sword Sect carriage at the gates of Ink Garden. Yi Zhengnan was a youth who did not fear strong enemies, or even death. But when he saw this handsome man, he still felt nervous and restrained, and still felt awe, because this handsome man was Tantai Guanjian. For a long time, Tantai Guanjian had been thought of as the strongest in Min Mountain Sword Sect other than Bailey Sushue. Many Realm 7 cultivators did not understand how Tantai Guanjian could be so fast, and how his sword in person could break through common sense and be multiple times faster than the flying swords of ordinary cultivators. Tantai Guanjian did not converse with Xiao Sharon, who was sitting cross-legged on the mat, but he was not in a hurry to enter the garden and seemed to be silently waiting for the sunrise. Yi Zhengnan had seen Tantai Guanjian at the sword trials, but for some reason, even then, he had not felt Tantai Guanjian was as serious as he was today. While there were no complicated ceremonies or procedures, and Tantai Guanjian was just standing there silently waiting for the sunrise, Yi Zhengnan clearly sensed that something major was happening. The sun rose in the east and shone down golden light. The sky was completely bright. Yi Zhengnan looked dazedly. He saw Tantai Guanjian's body was covered in a layer of gold. Then Tantai Guanjian nodded warmly at him from a distance, and then bowed slightly to Xiao Sharon. Then a gentle presence flooded out of his body and caused his body to become exceptionally clean. Even the finest dust on his indigo robes was blown away. Then Tantai Guanjian walked into Ink Garden. Chapter 344. Yi Zhengnan did not know why Tantai Guanjian had arrived at Ink Garden early, but had to enter Ink Garden after sunrise. Yet Ding Ning knew. When he learned of Tantai Guanjian's arrival, he had bathed and changed into clean new robes, and then waited silently for the sunrise. The reason he was so solemn was because this matter was more important to him than any other person. This meant his new life. From the first day he started to cultivate in Chongling, he had to obtain Min Mountain Sword Sect's heaven replenishing divine art. Otherwise, everything was meaningless, and only death awaited him. The heaven replenishing divine art was the highest skill of Min Mountain Sword Sect. It was a symbol of the entire sect and carried a kind of sacred feeling. If such a method was given to a disciple to learn, how could he sneak around like a rat in the dark when he was about to learn it? "You know why I have come?" Tantai Guanjian, who slowly walked into the garden, looked at Ding Ning, who was waiting for him in clean robes. He first returned the greeting Ding Ning and then asked gently. Ding Ning nodded and asked in a melancholy voice, "Wang Taishu has left?" Tantai Guanjian looked at him, his eyes showing undisguised admiration. He said, "He has left for the Yen." Ding Ning immediately recovered his calm. He looked up at him and said softly, "Did he not say he was going to Min Mountain Sword Sect Sword Tower? Why did you bring him here?" Min Mountain Sword Sect only cares about rules and not trifles. We are all shocked at your abilities to make a great leader of Chongling listen to you. Tantai Guanjian looked at him and said, "I originally thought a difficult matter would be so easily solved in your hands. But thinking that you do not have much time, The sect master decided to have me bring this book here. Ding Ning did not speak. He stood respectfully with his head bowed. While he did not have any extra etiquette, he waited with the most solemn appearance for Tantai Guanjian's teaching. Inner respect was more important than ceremony. Yantai Guanjian was even more satisfied with Ding Ning. He didn't say anything else. With a solemn expression, he took out a green jade box from his sleeve. Holding it with both hands, he handed it to Ding Ning. Ding Ning caught it with both hands. Even though the jade box was very small, just like the rectangular boxes used to hold expensive folding fans in Chongling, and did not have much weight, his hands still uncontrollably trembled. If you're done reading it, hand it over to Marshal Uncle Xiao outside the door. Yantai Guanjin looked at Ding Ning's trembling hands and thought this was a normal reaction from excitement. He patted Ding Ning's shoulder and then said gently, "This method is really hard to comprehend, so you have to hurry." After a pause, Yantai Guanjin looked into Ding Ning's eyes and said, "If you have something difficult to do, you can tell me. I will help you." Ding Ning showed an indescribable grimace. He thought and said, "Ensure the safety of Wang Taishu and my sect Uncle Li Daoji. Also, ensure the old man has a grand funeral." Hearing Ding Ning's request, Yantai Guanjin nodded and said harmoniously, "Do not worry about these things. You only need to focus on cultivation." Ding Ning bowed to salute. Yantai Guanjin looked at Ding Ning with anticipation in his eyes. He and Jing Lieli had the same thoughts. He had great confidence that Ding Ning could comprehend the heaven-replenishing divine art. Unlike usual, when Yantai Guanjin was here, Zhangsun Qianxue did not appear behind him like an omnipresent shadow. Ding Ning knew this was because Zhangsun Qianxue was too proud and stubborn. Many years ago, that person could not get a chance to enter Min Mountain Sword Sect and could not make up for some of the flaws in his cultivation. Zhangsun Qianxue had never expressed any intentions in this area to Ding Ning, but Ding Ning knew that in her heart, she could not forgive Bailey Sushue. In her view, that person's inability to get the heaven-replenishing divine art was one of the reasons his cultivation was restrained and he died in battle in Chongling. Even though she could not forgive that person, but this was her love and hate. So she would not look at Min Mountain Sword Sect's heaven-replenishing divine art, even if it was one of the best methods in the world. Ding Ning walked into his bedroom in the deepest part of the courtyard. Outside the window, the leaves of a loquat tree scattered the morning sunlight into many tiny light spots. This loquat tree had been moved here from the garden outside the small courtyard several days ago. Although it was not the right time to move it, it lived very well and was full of vitality. It made this small courtyard, which had been full of gloomy coldness, come alive. Ding Ning looked at the indigo jade box on the magenta table and was silent for a long time. Indeed, if that person had gotten this method many years ago, maybe many things would not have happened. Maybe he would have reached the peak of Realm 8 early on, or even Realm 9. The power of transcendence would cause Yuan Wu and many people to give up on their later thoughts. Yuan Wu would still become the emperor of the strongest empire in the world, but like before, he would listen to some of that person's opinions. The Bazin Kendo ground would not disappear and would become stronger. Zhang Xiu would not show her cold and emotionless side. She would become that person's gentle wife. Many people would not die. Above the Wei River, between the Ba Mountains and the Shu Rivers, when it rained on a banana night, the little buildings in the bamboo forest would be filled with laughter and singing. Some people would stand at the head of the little boats going down the river, drunk, and try to scoop up the bright moon in the river. Maybe all of this would be different. But was this really perfect? That person would never be able to see through many people. That person would never understand many things. The indigo jade box lay silently under the sparse spots of light. It had not been opened, but Ding Ning seemed to see two different lives. Ding Ning's emotions gradually calmed down. He reached out and opened the indigo jade box without much effort. His sleeves flapped despite the absence of wind. There was a thin, rolled-up book in the indigo jade box. Each page seemed to be woven from threads made from indigo jade. But indigo jade was clearly hard and fragile. How could it be made into threads and appear so soft? But people could see that this was indigo jade. This was extraordinary. Ding Ning took a deep breath and even his hair danced in the wind. This thin green book was emitting vigorous primal chi of heaven and earth on its own, like an endless fountain. His cultivation habit was to start from the big picture, to understand the general idea, and then the details would not be hard to figure out. Therefore, he was not in a hurry to sense where the primal chi of heaven and earth came from, or how many different strands of primal chi were flowing in the air along with the invisible seal scripts. Instead, he took out the thin book and flipped it open. There were many transparent lights on the green page. They were like drops of sparkling water droplets. However, the shape of each transparent light was in the shape of a sword. It was not deliberate. Ding Ning's perception was completely immersed in the indigo page and these transparent lights. He seemed to be standing in a world of indigo jade. There were many transparent long swords floating around him, pointing in different directions. Each sword was taller than his body. He started to look at each transparent long sword and slowly walked in the world of perception. He passed through these motionless transparent long swords. These transparent long swords were motionless, but they started to grow and extend in the direction they pointed. Most of the transparent long swords stabbed towards the sky, giving off an indescribably proud presence. As they extended, these transparent long swords seemed to pierce through the sky and break through the boundary between day and night. The transparent long swords started to shine, like starlight falling down through the pierced space, or like these transparent long swords themselves had become starlight. Each of the transparent swords was a star in itself. Ding Ning's presence did not change at all. Even Zhang Sun Qianxue, who was in the same courtyard as him, did not sense any changes in his body. However, many silver specks of light were seeping out of his skin. Ding Ning looked up in the world of perception. He murmured to himself with a tinge of sadness and disappointment. So that's how it is. Chapter 345. The truth of cultivation was the exploration of the mysteries of the body and the surrounding world. When one reached a certain level, many truths were connected. For some cultivators who had unimaginable cultivation experience, they only needed to know the method for many things. Just like the countless primal energies of the universe around them, they already knew the existence of those paths, unlike ordinary cultivators who did not even know where those paths were. They only needed to know the method, which paths were useful, and how to touch those paths. Or to use the most appropriate words to describe it, in the many years of the past, countless outstanding cultivators had continuously tried to use different orders and different strengths to stir these lines, testing the reactions produced. The vast majority of them did not succeed, because this kind of probing process was also related to luck. However, there were a small number of people who finally tested out a powerful cultivation method, which was why there were so many world-shocking chapters that were left behind in the future. For cultivators who had the same cultivation experience as those people, or even more, obtaining such astounding chapters just skipped the process of blind testing. In the eyes of anyone in Min Mountain Sword Sect, Ding Ning was just a cultivator who had just started. He needed to understand those simple seal scripts and some of the things this book had to express, as well as the primal energies of the universe and the paths. It would take a long time. Many of Min Mountain Sword Sect's Realm 7 geniuses spent half their lives and did not comprehend the true meaning of the heaven-replenishing divine art. But no one would have thought that the heaven-replenishing divine art was just a door for Ding Ning. He seemed to have just pushed lightly and easily pushed open this door in this morning. He had only used a moment to push open this door, but to see the heaven-replenishing divine art and this door, he had spent many years. What made him most emotional was that the noble mistress of the imperial palace, Zhang Xiu, could not have seen this ultimate manual of Min Mountain Sword Sect. Otherwise, she would have detected some similarities and differences between this method and the one she cultivated. She would have paid any price to obtain or destroy this method. If that person had not been on bad terms with Bailey Sushue back then, he would never have been able to enter Min Mountain Sword Sect. If that person could enter Min Mountain Sword Sect, and Zhang Xiu could follow him into Min Mountain Sword Sect and see this method, what would happen? So this was fate. The most unpredictable thing was fate. Ding Ning took a deep breath. His gaze changed from sadness to tranquility. He slowly put the green jade scripture away and placed it back into the box. The moment he closed the green jade box, energy stopped coming out of the heaven, replenishing divine art. His fluttering hair started to fall down. But at this time, the last flower remnant sword at his waist started to tremble. The true essence in his body began to flow. The countless sword threads at the tip of the last flower remnant sword started to light up slightly. The moment countless small white flowers bloomed like usual, the tips of the sword threads started to light up like starlight. The 5 chis in Ding Ning's body were already surging violently. The 5 energies within his 5 viscera were like a boiling steamer, constantly emitting out, while his 5 viscera were like water in a steamer, constantly drying up. When the water dries up, the pot will crack, and the 5 internal organs will deteriorate. At this time, the 5 energies in Ding Ning's energy sea started to burn fiercely. The burning produced a higher temperature and caused the 5 energies to spread even more fiercely. The water in the pot was about to quickly dry up. However, when these burning energies instantly collided and compressed in the narrow space, under the extremely high temperature, there were countless specks of silver light produced, as if countless small stars were formed from the explosion and combustion. The star energy floating in the vast world around him started to sway. As those small silver stars continued to compress in Ding Ning's body, like magnets, they became more attractive to these thin star energies. In countless invisible paths, the star energies that were of the same nature as these silver stars were naturally attracted over and seeped into his body like rain. The 5 chi was still constantly being forced out from his 5 inner organs, burning unceasingly. However, the amount of astral yuan chi gushing in from all directions was even greater than the amount of 5 chi that was being burned. So the water in the pot in his body did not dry up and slowly increased. The dried meridians, flesh, and blood in his body were being nourished. They slowly became plump and radiated with vitality. This was the true feeling of escaping death and obtaining a new life. The countless little silkworms hidden in the deepest parts of his body were nourished by the rain and suddenly rejoiced. Within the human sovereign jade annulus in his bosom, a ball of flickering yellowish light seemed to have sensed something as well, surging with unprecedented ferocity. Ding Ning's eyes were closed, but his eyelashes could not help but tremble. He felt shock. This was a cultivation speed that even he could not imagine. The 9-death silkworm and the heaven-replenishing divine art had shown astounding results. At this time, the effects of the human monarch jade annulus were stronger than usual. With the passage of time, the true essence flowing through his body, which was originally like a trickle, became more and more vigorous and gradually began to surge like a small river. His 5 viscera, which had originally dried up, began to move like a spring that had accumulated a lot of clear water. Even though he had intentionally suppressed it, he had just broken through to Realm 4 during the Min Mountain Sword trials. Then he had been seriously injured and had not had much time to cultivate. But to his shock, he felt that Realm 4 second class was not far away. Many destinies have gathered in Chongling. In the quiet imperial palace, in the Empress study, Empress Zheng Xiu stood in front of the spirit lotus pool. She looked at the spirit energy that spread over the pure white spirit lotus. She said to palace attendant Rong, who was standing respectfully with her head bowed, "Long ago, when the Qin dynasty destroyed the Han, there was such a saying in the world, because the brightest stars in the sky were always right above Chongling. In the past many years, the right time and right place had always proved this saying. The Qin dynasty, 800 miles of fertile land in Guangzhou, had good weather for many years and had never encountered any natural disasters. In the past, I was most worried about the Zhao. When the Zhao dynasty was destroyed, I did not worry about the Chu, Yin, and Qi. I only had to worry about Chongling's own matters. You must have power so that others will fear you. But just like the rules of Min Mountain Sword Sect, you must make people feel that you have rules. You must let people see that as long as they are talents of the Qin dynasty, you will yield and tolerate them. This way, everyone will naturally prioritize the Qin dynasty. Everything is in the open. At most, people will feel that I am domineering, but will not have many other thoughts. After saying this, the Empress finally looked up at Palace Attendant Rong and said, "As for you, you fear Ding Ning's talent, and fear that he will cultivate even faster after obtaining the heaven-replenishing divine art. One day, he will challenge and kill you. I can only tell you, since you are doing these things for me, I will not give him the chance to challenge you. I will not let such a thing happen. As to the heaven-replenishing divine art, if it is in his hands, it will be easier to obtain it from him than in the sword tower of Min Mountain Sword Sect." Palace Attendant Rong was not as fearful as other people facing the Empress. She nodded calmly and said, "I understand. In these years, the only one who can truly make you feel fear is this wine shop youth." Looking at Palace Attendant Rong, who had respectfully bowed and left, the Empress smiled slightly and said coolly, "I am growing more interested in this youth." Palace Attendant Rong bowed her head even lower. She thought it was better to admit terror than to truly face death. Many destinies are gathered in Chongling, but it is not certain who will truly receive the destiny. Palace Attendant Rong's figure disappeared from the cold hall. The faint smile on the Empress' face disappeared, and her eyes recovered their absolute coldness. She muttered to herself coldly. Suddenly, her body trembled slightly. She frowned and raised her head to look at the sky well above. When her gaze touched the blue sky, her perception had already landed on an even more distant starry sky. In the past many years, those cold stars were like her playthings. The star Yuan Qi that she couldn't touch was also something that no one else could touch. Yet at this time, she clearly sensed a slight change in the star energies in the world. But where this change came from and why, she could not grasp. At that moment, she even thought that she was hallucinating. Chapter 346. The carriage moved further and further away from Chongling. Gradually, they could not see the majestic outline of Chongling. Wang Taishu lifted the curtain of the carriage and looked back at Chongling. There was not much emotion in his eyes. He did not even bid farewell to Ding Ning. For him, what was important was not farewell, but whether they could meet again. The caravan stopped at a ferry. One of the carriage drivers helping Wang Taishu drive the carriage started to walk towards a carriage at the very end of the caravan in preparation to rest. But what puzzled most people in the caravan was that no one took over for the carriage driver when they were about to board the ship. At this moment, a man dressed in black walked down from a large ship that was docked on the shore. He walked straight to Wang Taishu's carriage. A pair of exceptionally steady hands gripped the reins at the front of Wang Taishu's carriage. He was very familiar with this because he had been Wang Taishu's carriage driver to begin with. Two men dressed as porters had been staying in the shadows of a storehouse by the docks, sitting with their backs against the wall. They looked tired and sleepy. The bamboo poles and ropes used to carry things were casually leaning against the wall, but they had been observing the caravan Wang Taishu was in. Seeing the black-robed man walk down from the ship, the two men dressed as porters unconsciously narrowed their eyes. At this moment, the two men who were dressed like porters suddenly sensed something and raised their heads abruptly. Wang Taishu's caravan had started to board the ship. This was an ironclad merchant ship that sailed overseas. At this moment, a very young man was standing on the deck at the bow of the ship. Youth was just a feeling. They felt that person was full of vitality, but that person was blind. While his eyes were open, they did not blink. He did not react to the surrounding light or anything. But this was likely the most terrifying blind person in the world. This was because in the perception of the two men dressed like porters, the young blind man was like a huge furnace. The raging fire seemed to want to completely burn through the bow of the iron-armored ship he was standing on and melt it. A man who looked like a porter was the first to lower his head. The other man beside him also lowered his head after a breath and said softly, "General Chui, what should we do?" The man who was addressed as General Chui said coldly, "Of course, we shouldn't do anything. Otherwise, we'll just be courting death." "Someone from the Zhao Sword Furnace?" The man beside him was unwilling and said softly, "Should we inform the Astrology Bureau? This is just General Yang's personal grudge. Do not forget how we were expelled from Chongling." The man called General Chui sneered. "Since it is impossible to defeat them, the The people of the Zhao Sword Furnace will always be Zheng Xiu's enemy. The stronger the enemy, the better. Also, the other has already left Chongling. What is the meaning in informing the astrology bureau? The man beside him didn't seem to agree with his words. After a moment of silence, he said, "What are they going to do overseas?" Boarding a ship overseas doesn't mean that you have to go overseas. The man called General Chui mocked, "They can disembark anywhere they want. After bypassing many checkpoints, it will be impossible to track them down. As to what they are going to do after leaving Chongling, what does that have to do with us? We are about to go to a barbaric place like the Nanyue border. I fear we need to consider our own problems." Should be 2 soldiers. When he steadily controlled Wang Taishu's carriage to board the ship, Jing Mazong, who had disappeared from Chongling for a long time, said to Wang Taishu in the carriage, "Do you want to kill them?" His voice was still respectful to Wang Taishu, but compared to before, it was filled with an indescribable determination and power. No one had to doubt his abilities. They should be General Liang Lian's people. I fear that most people in Chongling, including the Empress, underestimate him. Wang Taishu stilled slightly and then shook his head. He said, "There is no need to complicate matters." Jing Mazong bowed his head and did not speak, as though nothing had happened. The young blind man on the deck didn't pay the 2 cultivators who were disguised as porters any attention. His eyes were empty as he looked towards an unknown place, instead walking towards a middle-aged cook dressed in ordinary cloth clothes, calmly washing vegetables and killing fish in a corner of the ship. "Can we live in peace?" He walked past this middle-aged cook who seemed to be in charge of the ship's kitchen and said softly, "Including not revealing my relationship with Wang Taishu to Min Mountain Sword Sect. Otherwise, when the ship leaves, I will kill you with my sword." The middle-aged cook did not pause in her movements. She skillfully killed the fish, took out the innards, and prepared to throw them to a black cat lying in the shadows nearby. At the same time, she said simply, "Yes." The young blind man did not seem to sense her existence and walked towards the cabin without stopping, but his voice still reached the middle-aged cook's ears. His voice turned from absolute murderousness to a gentle request. "Can you leave the fish bladders? I like to eat them." The middle-aged cook did not respond and simply took out the white fish bladders from the innards she was going to throw away. The surface of the river connected to the way river rippled. The water in the deepest part of Chongling's great floating water prison was also rippling with white bubbles. Hearing the suppressed groans from the prison ahead, Lin Zhujiu struggled to look up. His seaweed-like hair dripped with water. He smiled unconcernedly and said, "My hope for survival comes from knowing that the 9-death silkworm has appeared in Chongling. The existence of the 9-death silkworm means that my enemies will be terrified. Thinking that no matter how strong my enemies are, they will still be terrified, I am very happy. But you, where does your hope come from?" After a long time, the groans from the prison disappeared. A muffled voice sounded. "My previous life was to die. Since I was saved, I naturally have to live well." Lin Zhujiu smiled. "This seems to be insincere." The voice from the prison disappeared for a long time before he remembered. "She will appear in front of me. Even if she cannot save me, she will die in front of me. I am waiting for her." "An interesting reason." Lin Zhujiu smiled happily and said seriously, "I will wait with you." On the cold stone steps not far from the 2 prison cells, Shun Xian, like a shadow, silently listened to the 2's conversation. In the past many years, he had only been unable to pry open Lin Zhujiu's mouth. But now, there was this nameless young person. Yi Xiling was quiet. The water in the ditch in the corner of the courtyard rippled. There was no longer white mist rising in front of by Shanshui. A glowing water droplet flickered in front of her as she breathed, and then gave people a feeling of increasing heaviness. Seeing this scene, Yi Xiling knew that Bai Shanshui had recovered her cultivation and had taken a great step forward in cultivation. She was more terrifying than at her peak. She could sense Bai Shanshui's thoughts. Yet she still shook her head and said, "There is a cultivator from Min Mountain Sword Sect outside Ink Garden. He will not be weaker than Yintai Guanjian. He will guard outside Ink Garden like a gatekeeper." Bai Shanshui knew what it meant to not be weaker than Yintai Guanjian. If she was already in Ink Garden, she might be confident she could hide her presence and not be discovered by this cultivator. But when this cultivator stood outside Ink Garden like a gatekeeper, anyone who wanted to enter Ink Garden could not escape his eyes and ears. Her brow furrowed slightly. After thinking for a moment, she looked seriously at Yi Sealing and asked, "Has he seen you before?" Yi Sealing glanced at her and said, "You want to pretend to be me and go in?" Bai Shanshui nodded and said, "If you help me, I can go in. Do you feel this is cruel?" Yi Sealing turned her head away and did not look at her. "If you go, I naturally have to hide here. But have you ever thought that after waiting here for so long, if I go and see, it is you who can go and I cannot?" Bai Shanshui naturally knew how much emotion and danger was contained in this. Her expression grew solemn, and then she bowed deeply to Yi Sealing and said, "Bureau Chief Yi, please help. Help me act out this play. Go at noon and return at dusk." Yi Sealing said coldly, "I happen to be going to kill someone. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.